Why hello my fellow apes, I hope you are well. What follows is a deep dive review into my recent debate with Colin Wright on the topic of gender, hosted by Peter Boghossian. Joining me in this extensive conversation are Nathan Ormond from the channel Digital Gnosis and Reese from Low Fruit. From defining what it means to be a man or woman, to addressing issues such as bathroom access, to discussing the difficulties of gender-affirming care for children, the aim of us three cis dudes is to provide a thorough insight into how those of us who view gender as a social construct approach these issues. It could be that we've all gone woke, or it could be that there's room for rational disagreement. Who knows? Ribbing aside, we'd love to hear your thoughts. If you think that we, and especially I, have got anything wrong, please do let us know. My goal has always been truth, regardless of how unpopular my view might be, and after having the great fortune of conversing with the likes of Colin Wright and Thomas Boghossian, who have each helped me refine and better articulate my views, I have grown ever more confident that, at least on the topic of what is a woman, I've got this one right. Despite this, I know I could be wrong, so please engage with us. The point is open dialogue, open discourse on this controversial topic that desperately needs it. Now, the audio from my debate with Colin is pretty poor, but it only makes up a small percentage of this video. I've tried my best to fix it, but alas, my editing skills just aren't quite there. The last thing to get on the table before we get to it is my descriptive view of gender. To be clear, this is the same view I had when debating Colin. However, at the time, I did a poor job of articulating it. Gender is a very difficult word to define. This is something that Thomas very much emphasised during our conversation, which I'm aiming to publish within a few weeks. But here's how I have gender. It's phenotype, aesthetics, and behaviours typically associated with a particular sex. The word phenotype is doing a fair amount of the heavy lifting, and I've realised that I need to do a better job of expanding upon what this is, as it's not really common knowledge. Phenotype refers to an individual's observable physical characteristics and traits, which result from the interaction of their genetic makeup and environmental influences. So what are these characteristics and traits? Well, first, we have primary sexual characteristics. These are the physical features, such as genitalia, penis, vagina. Then we have secondary sexual characteristics. These develop during puberty and include traits like breast development, body hair distribution, voice pitch, and muscle mass. And then we have body structure and shape. These are general body proportions, such as broader shoulders or wider hips, that are often associated with male or female bodies. These all constitute phenotype, and I believe they play a much bigger role in manhood or womanhood than, say, chromosomes. Talking of manhood, here's how I define a man. A person whose phenotype, aesthetics, and behaviours are typically associated with an adult human male. Conversely, here's how I define a woman. A person whose phenotype, aesthetics, and behaviours are typically associated with an adult human female. What this hopefully conveys is that, in my view, while the vast majority of women are adult human females, not all women are adult human females. This one isn't, for instance. This is Emily Quinn, an admirable woman who in her TED Talk speaks about her condition of complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, a condition where a person is genetically male, that is XY chromosomes, testicles, etc., but their body is resistant to male hormones, androgens, which leads to the development of female characteristics, vagina, breasts, etc.
I found out I was born without a uterus, and inside my body, I have testicles instead of ovaries.
By my view, Emily is a woman. She is a male, yes, but she absolutely is a woman. But by the view that says a woman is an adult human female, she isn't a woman, and this has some pretty horrible entailments regarding how she is expected to live her life and what areas she has access to. Either this, or proponents have to make special exceptions for people like Emily, which isn't a sign of a strong view. Alright, that will do it for now. Nathan, Reese and I begin our conversation by listening to me ask Colin if there's room for rational disagreement. That is, can people endorse different views of gender and yet both be rational? Here was his answer.
Yes, I will say that I agree with Stephen. People can hold these two definitions. I'm happy to disagree on the utility or even the ethics, I think, of these definitions and things like that, yeah.
I think, and part of his agreement there is also because obviously he thinks that he's got the moral victory as well.
Probably.
Your views are aggressive.
I actually think that this is a really important point of agreement, because it really is almost one of the biggest points of contention.
It's one of the problems with this discussion,
and that is that you're just an ideologue. You're just woke. you've bought the, like you've swallowed this pill, or you've done, like the in-group, out-group is such a corrosive thing to the values that these people tend to espouse, which is honest, free conversation.
The free marketplace of ideas.
Yeah, and yet with Colin saying this, well, I think that's a great takeaway, because it means that there is room for rational disagreement.
And that's and not everyone who's on that side of like disagree. I mean, I think each of us, we have like different differences between ourselves, but I mean broadly we're in one like camp on this view. But I think it's worth saying that not everyone who talks about gender ideology and is like like anti-trans or whatever is in agreement as well. So like even though I think Colin's views are mistaken, he's perhaps displaying certain intellectual virtues such as openness, the ability to entertain different ideas charitably and think about them, that maybe some people aren't because they're more closed off.
Yeah, and what I want to say on this as well is a lot of this closeness and this sort of like that, a lot of it is social media based. My usual work environment has a lot of very conservative people in it. A lot of them have expressed very bigoted things towards trans people and stuff, or they've just made passing comments that you would consider bigoted. And then I've had a conversation with them for just 10 minutes, and they're like, that actually makes sense.
Yeah.
And it just shows even normal people,
Yes,
when they're outside of this
assumptions.
setting, they can have the discussions and they can have realizations.
And I will say that is actually a mistake that I've seen happen from trans activists. I understand why. And that is that they see someone say something that is pretty damn nasty, and they make the assumption that it's coming from a place of hate, where often it is actually ignorance. And if you have a conversation with them, you will actually make some progress. It might not be on the spot, because that's not how humans work, but they will go, okay, and they go back and they think about it and they might change their view. I know that this can happen because it happened to me. And I know that this can happen because I've seen it happen in lots of people, like what you're mentioning with work.
Yeah, me as well, actually, you know what kind of thing of it. Because I was like similar, I was kind of like anti... I was like basically
Eastern Church.
Well, I was kind of like, there's a reality about it. I was like Jordan Peterson pilled, right? And now my views are like very, very different. I educated myself out of those views, I like to say. But but even like in my Discord server, I've got quite a few like trans people, right? And one of like some of them express the fact that they get very upset when people will come in who have some more kind of like bigoted views. But some of them, what they've tried to do is like I've been saying, if you can just like often people's reasons are not rational actually why they've adopted these positions in the first place. And if you can kind of just befriend these people and stuff, they'll become more sympathetic to like the types of identities you want to adopt just by you being friendly and nice to them as someone who adopts this identity, right? And it won't be because of arguments or anything like that. And
you've got to show you're a human being as well, and you're not as deranged as they say.
They're being told because it's getting the airtime.
And like I don't have like good statistics on this, but like at least in my Discord, that's kind of like worked for some people, but also for the like trans people who were initially very upset. They've been like, oh, this has actually kind of helped me to be less reactive about this thing that's super, like important to me as well. So I think just. Those sorts of like treating people as humans and talking to them about their concern rather than just isolating and kind of like doubling down on rhetoric.
We've said it before in like Low Fruit and stuff, that just people need to start recognising that the person that they're talking about or to is also a human being, and engage with them on that level.
And that exposure to, say, trans people or to people that have the different views to you, I guess to use an analogy here, or something that has like an equivalent, a lot of people just don't understand mental health. No. But then if they hang around someone that has mental health problems, or they are just put at least in proximity to that, they'll end up developing a better understanding of what's going on and realizing it's not that they're lazy or something along those lines, or they're not trying hard enough. You'll end up developing that empathy and realizing, okay, right, I'm lucky almost because I'm a normal functioning brain. I'm just throwing it in. Okay. This is therapy for you right here. Yeah. Well, on that note,
the way that I would define a man to be, it's someone who lives up to a social construct that heavily correlates with phenotype, aesthetics, and behaviors. That's the way I define a man.
Oh yeah.
I know,
The
unbelievable.
worst definition.
That's it, I'm out. I do think there was some criticisms of my definition that are absolutely worth taking on board and expanding upon. So
the thing is in conversations we've had previously, we'd had slightly better definitions than that anyway. Yeah. And obviously one of the problems with a debate format is you're not necessarily, where you're not using a scripted sort of thing, is you'll recall parts of what you're thinking of and give that out. So you're largely there, but what you end up with is when you say lives up to, people are saying, so you're expecting them to, you're prescribing that they have to have
when
these
that's not the
traits.
case.
Yeah.
I was basically saying typically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And where they were both the same for man and woman, people were saying, it's like, so what is the difference?
I should have said male phenotype, female phenotype.
So,
correct. Yep. Correct.
A slightly reformed version of this that I've got written down. Obviously, this isn't the one you were using in the video, but a man is a person whose phenotype, aesthetics, and behaviours are typically associated with an adult human male.
That's fair. Yep, that works.
Because one of the problems I think with they want that adult human male part in the definition.
Yes, you give them what?
Because they want you to recognise that there is a biological component to it, and there is generally, or typically.
Typically, yes. Escape hatch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the definition, certainly that one, it shows that we're not trying to destroy the existing framework, is we're trying to show, look, there's a little bit more to it than just that one thing.
Yeah. I think
it's essentially, as you say later in the debate, just make a bit of room.
Yeah, really.
Let's include intersex, let's include trans people in the definition.
Yeah, my view is so close to what they've got. It's just got that flexibility, which they make exceptions for anyway.
They make the exceptions for anyway. You're just trying to put those.
But mine accounts for
into
it, whereas theirs is, well, we've just essentially just have to ignore it.
Yeah.
But yes, I do think that having more time to reflect on that definition and reading comments and talking with you guys, there is a better way that I can define that, and it would be by emphasising that the phenotype is typical of male and female. Now, you had a good objection, which was to do with mine being a net that cast too broadly.
Well, I think what happened to psychologise you a little bit. Well, it was probably you were focusing on the nature of the disagreement about the socially constructed aspect, right? And so you, in your definition, you kind of dialed in on those components.
Yeah.
But then I think what you basically gave a characterization of is maybe something more so like gender, right? And that's why it's the same for both male and female than like the relevant differences between male and female that you wanted to get in.
Yep.
So the way that I'd think about like a definition is that when you're providing someone with that definition, you'd want them, someone having heard it who didn't understand the word, to be able to go on using the word in some respect. So
immediately know what you're trying to say.
So I think the reason, so you've kind of given this general characterization of what the relevant disagreement is between you and Colin when it comes to like a gendered language or male, female, even sex language, right? And it's that you want to include aspects like social roles, psychology, stereotypical things, all that in the concept.
And that's all in a descriptive sense, of course. But yeah.
But that in the but that is the relevant difference. But because you've not said anything about which social roles, which stereotypes, and I think that in your characterization of male and female, you'd want to say something about that.
Yeah.
So someone who didn't understand the words could now go, oh, I didn't know what male meant to you, but now you've said, typically associated with being stronger, typically associated with being more aggressive, or something like.
So this is one thing that's very, very important to cover. When we say this, it's not you have to live up to the stereotypes to be a man or a woman. It's that there are stereotypes that inform our understanding of what man and woman are.
Yes, and
they're not always.
They're culturally
100%.
contingent. So this is
culturally contingent.
Exactly. The point about social construction, I think that the work that can be good work that social construction does is it highlights that concepts that people are taking to be inevitable are not as inevitable as they're being presented as seeming, right? Yeah. And so, when we say these things, and then there's kind of like different analyses of social construction that we can kind of provide. So some of those are going to be historical, and we look at, well, there's historical differences. Some of those are going to be in terms of social dynamics and forces that shape, things being the way they are. But all of these accounts that are provided do some work to undermining that sense of inevitability, because it's like, well, if historical forces had been different, they could, then the concept would just work this slightly different way, or that, and the mere fact of the lack of inevitability also doesn't tell you anything about how you should go on to change it. Those are going to be different reasons you provide. But it's that recognition of the fact that we can change it, then means that we can kind of combine that with our respect for people's autonomy, liberty, and all that, to say, well, if there is this concept, what ways is it harming people? If it's a bad concept, how do we want to refine it and change it so as it works in the best way possible in the world?
Yeah, and I think I'll just add to that the reason why I would go for a broad definition is that if you're asking what is gender, or what is a man, or what is a woman in a specific context, for example, what is a man according to England, you can actually get into more specifics, and you can actually start referencing more things and give more details, which is going to have greater utility in understanding how the word's used. But when you want to go to an abstract level and go, okay, a lot of what England views as a man doesn't work with how they used to view it as a man in England, and it doesn't work with how it's used in other countries. So you look for a definition that's going to encompass this.
A lot of contradictory edge cases even,
and that's why the more broader definition, the meta definition that I gave, is the one that I think is going to be more helpful. But I think in terms of understanding the specifics and being able to use it, you do actually need to go into each culture to understand
I think the
how
problem
they're
is
using those words.
the problem with it being sort of uninformative in a way. It's like because it's almost so broad, it's kind of like you said, well, the word is the way people use it, or something like that, right? Which is, it's an important thing to bring up, because there is actually disagreement between the two of you about, the role of definitions and how language works and stuff. But it's almost, there's also a sense then in which it makes it kind of trivially true. It's like, well, yeah, that's true, but what are we actually getting into here, kind of thing. I think you've acknowledged.
I just want to elaborate a bit more. So if we use the adult human male thing, I can show that this isn't how it's been used in other countries historically, for example. So China, when you had the empires, and they would have these inner courts with the women and all the rest of it, men would be barred from going into this inner court. However, a eunuch, a man who's had his testicles removed, could, because he was no longer considered a man. So it's not using that male definition there.
Well, you also have problems between different languages too that aren't English as well. What I mean by that is, because the assumption, right, because it gets so complicated so fast, the assumption is that there's a language of thought underlying all of these definitions. And then because we're English speakers, we try and basically use English as the base language, and we go, well, there's a proposition, that's what we mean by the English word, and all of these other languages reduce into that. And it's like, well, actually, why are we privileging English in that way? Why is one concept more privileged than some other? And in our overall theory, you could do that still. That's one model, but it's like I wouldn't go with a model that privileges English in that. I'm not saying you are exactly doing that, but I'm saying it's something to be aware of, because then you can look at, well, there are uses of language across cultures that seem to be the way I might translate the English word man or woman, but there's not this one-to-one mapping. And what's the more legitimate concept then? Is it this one or that one? What's the correct, the universal correct way of conceptualizing it? Sorry to interrupt your part.
No. You kind of covered what I was trying to say.
This is why you're here, Nathan. We want a review.
You've kind of covered what I was trying to say. Is these definitions that we use here aren't the ones that get applied elsewhere. That's kind of what I was trying to say with the China example there. Is we can't. Why do we get to say that our definition, or this historical definition we've had, is the correct one when that's not what we're seeing used elsewhere? You've kind of just covered that. So
okay.
So that is my definition, and us expanding on what its weaknesses are and how that can be corrected, and the fact that phenotype, and specifically male and female phenotype, needs to be emphasized. That's one of the takeaways I got from it. I felt it was productive. I actually enjoyed my conversation with Colin.
Yeah, whose primary reproductive anatomy is organized around or has the function to produce small gametes.
There's an initial sort of, you want to put this in a non-question begging way, right? But that I think that there are people whose reproductive systems have been, say, maybe they were, here's an initial case. Someone who was born with a reproductive system like that developed through puberty, but then they sustained damage, say through a car crash or war or some kind of horrible cancer or something, such that they no longer produce, they don't have a reproductive system any longer that's organized around producing those gametes. So do they then cease to have a sex at that point? I think you want to say no. But then the point is like, well, then we can revise the concept further. We bring history into it. We say in their historical past, but then we can point to examples of people where they were born with deformities, or they never developed through puberty. So now, do they not have and I mean, you could bite the bullet for consistency's sake. You say, no, I'm so convinced of this characterization that you're right, I won't call those people, but at least I wouldn't want to.
And neither does Colin.
Yeah.
So Colin, like, because there's Colin's definition, which interestingly, as we said before, isn't pertaining to chromosomes. It's not necessarily going specifically on gametes. It's actually on the biological.
Which is why your definition of sex said typically has XY.
Yeah. But whereas mine says typically, because it wants to account for things that are not falling into the set of conditions that you typically see. Colin will say, there's some outliners, but we can ignore them.
Yeah.
Or, treat them as the same, but they're actually not. And this is where, like, the definitions are actually quite close. And yet, for me, the utility in how they deal with a situation is just night and day.
It's like I've got a definition, but it's not what the word always means.
So you've got a definition that acknowledges that there's some fuzzy lines, whereas he's drawn these hard lines and said, yes, there are fuzzy lines, but I'm just ignoring them.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, then you don't explain the data that you're trying to explain. You're actually ignoring data.
And basically, the way that I see it, and as we'll see later on, the second any criticism is brought up, such as bathrooms and how you're going to implement that view, any scratch of that view, they actually just retreat to my position anyway.
Yeah.
But they still want to claim that they've got, this right answer, this biologically essential answer, and it's just.
Well, we'll get to some of that, because
there's a point to raise about his definition too, which is, a lot of people who are in the kind of like gender critical sort of crowd will often provide their characterization of sex in terms of like chromosomal differences. Now, like one reason or motivation to maybe not accept that view and prefer Colin's view is because of counterexamples of intersex people. So it's perfectly fine to sort of modify your view for principled reasons to accommodate more data. But the point is that if you're someone who advocates for, a chromosomal definition, and then you're like, that's weird, I would have thought Colin would agree with me. Why does he disagree? Oh, he wants to accommodate these cases as well. So now I'm going to modify my definition, right? And then the point is that that's basically the same line of reasoning that's being used now to persuade someone away from Colin's position towards an even more expansive position that can accommodate even more data, right? More of the data that we want to accommodate. And so I think that the point I'm making is just to appeal to people who might be gender critical and have previously disagreed with Colin's definition to go, if I'm willing to modify and abandon my definition in line with what this biologist is saying, because he's saying that other view actually isn't good enough to accommodate, then maybe you should be open to other people's like providing information as well that might expand your view. That's
a great point. Yeah, the fact that the communicators are changing their definitions up should be telling you that this isn't.
It's not as clear as you might
not as
be
easy as you
assuming.
think.
I have a clarifying question about. Sure, of course. What you specified about chromosomes not being across the board for males and females, fantastic point, absolutely the case. Thanks for bringing that up. When it comes to humans, what role do the chromosomes play in producing these organs? Are they always something that produce these organs, or are they not? Yeah, it's an extremely tight correlation, but it's really specific genes that are on the chromosomes. So like when we say that males have XY chromosomes because there's a gene on the Y chromosome called SRY, and that's sort of what kicks development down the male pathway. And so it's not the chromosome itself that is causing the male to develop, it's the specific region of genes on the chromosome, and that can be transposed. Doesn't necessarily reside always on a Y chromosome, even though it almost always does.
Yes, so this is important, right? Because in line with what I was just previously saying about someone might provide what seems like a sharp, clear-cut distinction, but then a biologist might come along and say, there's more data we want to accommodate, even though there's an extreme... basically, what I'm saying is, from Colin's point of view, an extremely high correlation isn't sufficient to provide a essentialist characterization, right? Colin's saying even a small proportion of counterexamples to this for him is enough for him to modify his definition in favor of this other view.
Later on.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
And so the question would be, well,
why have you done it?
Why in one case but not in the other?
That's exactly kind of what I was on the line of thinking there is, right, there's these small outliers here that mean this definition is insufficient and needs to be changed.
He said it's
we remove the chromosomes. Tight. And then later on we'll talk about how, well, you've got complete androgen insensitivity. So, well, we'll just treat them as a woman. We won't modify the definition because they're a small outlier.
And yet... Yeah.
And it's like, well, hang on, you've changed the definition here. Or you're using a certain definition here because of the small outliers.
Yes.
So why are you doing it in this one case and then not modifying it elsewhere?
Just to land that from a different angle, he could just say, it's chromosomes.
Yeah.
Yes, there's some exceptions, but whatever. That's the way he
exactly what you did in your definition.
Yeah.
Typically,
he could just say typical. Yeah, and that would do the work as well.
And for all the people in the comments that have complained about Steve and by extension me using the word typical in definitions, it's everywhere. It really is everywhere.
Yeah, it is.
And you obviously brought up a great example of mammals. Mm-hmm. Mammals typically give birth to live young is one part of the definition. Yeah. Because we have examples where they don't.
Well, it's because if you don't include that word typically, well, then you're providing necessary conditions, right? Yes. And there are very few things which submit themselves to necessary conditions in ordinary language, because typically that only happens typically in cases like mathematics, like artificially constructed languages that have been created for. So even in the sciences, you might get more rigid definitions of things, but there's different phenomena like discrete or continuous phenomena that are going to be slightly different. But the point is that when people are actively thinking about language construction for some specific purpose, they might have more rigid, clear-cut cases. But most ordinary language really is, it's complicated the way that it's arisen. It's evolved naturally through a kind of, not through natural, but a process like natural selection of things catching on as they've been used more, and then they've been kind of modified and changed, and there's a lot of like metaphorical connections between different bits of language. Like if you look at a word like light, for example, like a light that comes from a light bulb versus the light of reason versus
words having all these different reasons.
And if you try to provide, well, what's the necessary condition? What's a condition that's common between each of these different cases? Well, you're going to find it difficult to find some set of core essential features there. Yeah. That carries across all. You can find like resemblance between each, a kind of like maybe like a set of different things. You're like, oh, there's a kind of similarity that's metaphorical, but between all of them together, there's a kind of family resemblance instead.
Yeah, and just for one more point with an example.
Yeah.
Because we like our castle examples.
We do. So it works.
I think the common definition you'll find is a fortified structure typical of the medieval period for a person of wealth or nobility. So it doesn't always have to be for a person of wealth or nobility, and it doesn't always have to be of the medieval period.
Right, it wouldn't cease to be a castle if a poor person built one.
So, but what we're doing is we're capturing what the broad concept
mostly,
is.
Yeah, right.
So when we talk about, again, you could say, oh, well, you're stereotyping castles. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, you're being prescriptive.
I'm being prescriptive. Yeah. So when we have our definition of gender here, and we say is the aesthetics, phenotypes, and behaviours typical of an adult human male, is we're describing what broadly we recognise a man to be, acknowledging that there's outliers.
And just to emphasise it again, it's a description. It's not a prescription.
Yeah.
You don't want it to be that way, but it just is.
And Stephen you even argue for reform, right?
Dude.
Of the,
Yeah.
So it's like
I want to get rid of gender because of his stereotypes.
You're just
Because precisely. Yeah, they bring up, here's some of the views, things that I don't like about your descriptive view, and I'm like, yeah, me neither.
Yeah.
I agree with you, but it is what it is. Like,
it still is that. Yeah.
Let's change it together.
Yeah.
Let's get into the regression together.
Think, for example, about I don't know, like a racial slur, and I know which one you're all thinking of now. It's like so. But if you ask, well, what's the definition of that racial slur, right? It's like, well, that's not an endorsement of it. The fact that you provided it, you're providing a characterization of how it's used. But that's consistent with you saying no one should ever use that, and it doesn't like pick out some genuine like feature of reality where people are worse than others or something.
And you've made me think of other examples. So I do think examples really do help here. Describing animal rights today, I can describe what they are. I don't like it. I want to change it, but I'm going to describe what it is because that is what it is. So yeah, that might imply that I don't want animal rights. I actually want more, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
After getting the definitions on the table, Peter said, okay, Colin, tell me what you don't like about Steve's view, and then we'll move on to Steve, and you can say what you don't like about Colin's view. And what we're going to go through now is the criticisms that Colin had of my view, and we're going to unpack them.
I don't think it's a good or ethical definition of man.
Okay, can you please tell him why?
Because I guess I sort of reject the premise that the notion of being a man or a woman has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with identity.
So, Stephen, does your definition have nothing to do with biology?
No. There's quite a lot to do with biology.
Then I won't say to you that your definition has nothing. Sorry, you.
No, you're absolutely correct.
Is he said Stephen's definition has to do with identity?
Yes.
Right. At no point in the definition
I don't mention
did he mention
I
identity.
don't think that's actually an accurate description of what's happening.
Yes.
I actually don't think that it's the best prescriptive situation to get to.
Obviously, identity is part of psychology, and it does play a role.
Yep.
But it's not.
Yeah, gender discourse, like there's a feature of identification.
Yes. But it's not the key part, and it's certainly not what we're judging other people on.
And it's not sufficient.
It seems that this was missed on Colin's audience in particular. And I say Colin's audience, it's Peter's audience. And that is that I've made very clear that my view actually has a lot to do with sex. It's to do with phenotype, right? This is explicitly sexual content I'm relating to.
Heavy correlation.
Heavy correlation even. And yet Colin's objection was that it's not rooted at all in biology, and that it relies on self-identification, which I explicitly didn't state. And in the video that they were reviewing of me and Forrest, I actually argue with Forrest on this, where he argues for the self-identification view, and I argue against it. So it also implies that they didn't even watch my video.
They definitely didn't watch your video. Some of the issue that might have arisen here was this slightly unclear definition that we've already talked about.
Totally.
Yeah, maybe
if you had said male phenotype, at least that might have given.
Where is the self-ID coming from?
I think it's maybe just because they're so familiar. I think maybe I'm wrong, but I think that could be just. Maybe it's because when you said those stereotypes and things, maybe he's assuming what you mean by that is that someone has to themselves identify with those or perform those stereotypes. So it's like an individual choice. Maybe that's the angle. That's
essentially
the most I can get out of it.
But in any case, it's just not, my view. Let's actually break down self-ID to distinguish why, at least I don't buy it, why you don't buy it. If you buy it, I don't know, and I know that you don't. But it would be worth breaking that down because it will help distinguish it from the view that I have, for instance.
This will require a full 20-minute video, so this will have to be a very brief rundown.
Right, do you want me to go first? Or
I'm happy to go.
Come on in there, man.
So the first thing I'll say is where I'm sympathetic to or align with some of the concerns that self-ID people have, right? One of the concerns is that they want to be more permissive of people who have, non-standard gender identities and their right to have those identities. That's one thing. And the other thing is I think that often they want to say that the idea that there's some essential truth maker for having a particular gender identification well, that is kind of an unworkable notion. I'm quite sympathetic to both of those concerns. The pushback that I would provide, one of them is actually going to be the exact same pushback that I'd provide to this essentialist characterization, which is that it's just not a description of how people do in fact use gendered terms. There are a bunch of, now we can argue to reform what those stereotypes are, what those social roles are, and so forth, but still the terms are used in cases to apply to those social roles and stereotypes, right? And so that is what the words mean, but you can say we should reform them in this way, and that's a different thing. The second thing is that I do actually think it's too permissive, so it changes the grammatical role of gender terms, so it becomes something more like, like I'm a person or something like that. And I want to say that I think that this language, it just does something a bit more precise than that, right? Because of its relationship to features like reproduction, like partners, like adopting different roles in relation to sports and stuff like that. So even if you think of someone who's like a trans person, for example, where they want to adopt the opposite gender role, it's not just that they want to be accepted as a person, it's that there's a set of kind of like roles and things in society that belong to a gender that they want to be able to adopt themselves. And that's like a subset of just like personhood or something like that. It's like a specific thing that's defined, it again in contrast to something else, to like maybe male personhood. And there are difficult conversations to be had about where exactly those boundaries are. But I think that the self-ID thing is good in the sense that it's permissive, so it's going to respect more people's like autonomy to want to identify in the ways they want. Yeah. But I think that my criticism is that it's too permissive, and so we kind of collapse we deviate so much from what the concept means ordinarily that we're just talking about something so radically different that I just don't think it maps back anymore.
There's two parts to it. Is if what you see as a woman has no attributes, what are you identifying with? So if it doesn't have phenotype, if it doesn't have aesthetics or behaviors, and it doesn't even have being female, what is a woman? It's got no. It's not even got no necessary or sufficient. Well, it's got nothing.
Yeah, there's no criteria for correct use. Well, there are criteria for correct use, but it's the same criteria as a word like I or self. Yes. Do you know what and it's like, but that word isn't what I mean. Yeah, you've changed it so much.
And here's the other part that I want to put into. When we're saying man or woman or just language in general, it's about communicating something. It's reverse mind reading. You're trying to put something into someone else's head. If your thing has no conditions to it whatsoever, when you tell someone you're a man, you're a woman, that doesn't mean anything to them.
However you use it is correct. You could be using it in completely contradictory ways.
Exactly.
And either of those would be right. Yeah. If that were the right definition.
So this is the thing with pronouns. Why I don't subscribe to neo-pronouns, for example, is they don't convey anything to me. He, she, they, I understand, right? Whether it's a singular they or a plural they, I can guess the context. But when you're using j'es and jers and all the rest of it, I don't actually know what you're conveying to me because they don't have any established meaning of any sort. So if we're all about communicating things to each other, we do need some sort of attributes to be ascribed to them.
But just to say as well that you don't have to, you can be critical of self-ID and accept neo-pronouns. So like I think I'm more sympathetic towards them than you are. I'm not like, it's not about, but just to say like, you can still accept.
Well, the thing to me is if someone could convince me of the value of neo-pronouns.
Yeah, sure.
I just haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, you want to put a bit more meat on the bones of those concepts because you're not really sure what the criteria of use are because you're not sure what they're...
Because they're not out there in society, so there's no common understanding for it. Because again, like I say, it's definitions and language. It's all about common understanding. Yeah. And that's what we're putting across with what gender is. If you're only self-ID, there's no common understanding.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to expand and reiterate much of what you both said.
Hopefully in a clearer way.
Hopefully in a less clearer way, yeah. But I've also got maybe some slight additions. So first of all, I look at the motivations behind the self-ID route. And what happens is you don't want to go up to someone who identifies as, say, a man and tell them that they don't, or tell them that they're not a man. It doesn't matter if this, in terms of utility and like making a prosperous, happy world, you really don't want to be. You want to be like maximally liberal on this, that you can be, but if you become too liberal, you rob it of all of its utility, and it doesn't mean anything. So castles again is the example that I like. If you say, okay, we need to broaden the definition of castle, we've got reason to broaden the definition of castle, because you know those Japanese castles, they actually use completely different materials and they're built for very different reasons. So let's bring it into the throw. But if you broaden it to the extent where you just say it's a fortified building, it ain't meaning anything, because my house is a fortified building, right? You've broadened it to the point where it's lost actually the utility. So when I mention a castle, it doesn't convey anything.
Yeah.
Now, this is actually one of the motivations for self-ID. They're essentially trying to break down the system, and one way that you can do it is through self-ID.
It's getting rid of the stereotypes.
But here's the sense in which it's too permissive, though, right? Is that so you want to be more permissive to the degree that there are these clear cases you want to include of where you're like, well, this person identifies as trans, and I agree with all their values. I want them to feel accepted in the world and stuff. But then maybe there are some cases you can point to as well, and these are typically going to be the cases you see on like anti-trans or gender-critical channels, which are going to be, people who are maybe acting more predatory or using some of this stuff in a way that not just it's weird in the sense it like makes me feel icky or something because that's not the sexuality I have or something, or it's not what I'm attracted to, but in a sense where it's like, no, I actually want a boundary there because it's not like you're genuinely trying to be a trans person, but you're like, I don't know, wearing huge breast implants to school. Like that's this particular case that often gets referred to. And I want I want to be able to both say to like the people I have who are like trans friends, whatever, yes, you're a woman, and exclude this like particular really fringe case, yes, but I want to be exclusive of some cases. I don't want to permit that.
Because once you make it so broad, it can actually be utilised in ways that you don't want it to be utilised.
Exactly.
And it will be as well. This is where people will go, okay, I'm a woman right now.
Yeah, so,
and they do things like that.
And I think that this is a big part of the criticism then that pushes people towards an essentialist point of view, right? Because they go, well, I'm that concerned about the predator who's literally they're only saying I'm a woman to get access to women to abuse them. And look, this is a super minority case. Yep. It's not representative of trans people, their intentions at all. Yep. But it does happen.
It does. But you know what the rejoinder is, right?
Okay.
The rejoinder would be, no, you say, Piers Morgan saying I'm a woman, that doesn't work. However, does he actually identify as a woman?
Well, what does actually mean?
Verify that?
Yeah,
but the problem is the problem is they've collapsed actually to the act of identifying, and the act of identifying is only that pragmatic utterance. I am a woman. That's the only.
And if they
criteria.
say if there is, even in the questioning of does it actually map onto what? Because you've just said that there is no cluster of definitions or conditions that are relevant,
except the performance of the utterance.
Except for how Piers Morgan sees a woman, and that's it.
I think the people pushing for self-ID will have the hardest job to convince anyone.
I think it's a losing project. They will lose
because I don't think it makes any sense of society. It doesn't make sense to the vast majority of people.
But we're being consistent.
Let me
because this is where unfortunately you get this. Oh, I'll identify as an attack helicopter thing.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And I know it's a mockery of, but the problem comes about is when you tell people that man and woman have no meanings, no conditions of whatsoever. A person who hears that is then, so I can be anything then. It doesn't matter.
Because you're talking like an optics thing. Like just from optics, this isn't the way to
It's not just optics. It's you're going to have people that think this.
Yeah.
Because they're not going to be able to understand what you're saying because you're not conveying anything. The words have no meaning.
What you're moving into now, and this would be my second objection, we've been talking about prescription and what we want to do. Whereas actually, if you move into that descriptive field, which you touched upon, this just isn't how gender's used. It isn't. No. It's not used this way. So in terms of just like trying to observe what it is, you're just wrong. That isn't how it's used. Now, is there a relationship between self-ID and the way that gender has changed over time? Definitely. It's like there's a relationship that works like this.
So it's the non-conformity part. So gender non-conforming people, there's an identity aspect.
And they will
to what
change
they're
it
saying.
slightly.
But even
not
gender conforming people, gendered concepts relate to our identification of self, like how we conceptualize ourselves as a person in society, the roles we adopt, and so forth. Right? There's a self ID aspect to it. It's just not.
It's not the end all of it.
Yeah.
This is another one where the whole conversation and everything is so fuzzy that it's hard to pin something down on it. And I think that's the one why it will fail ultimately. It's the fuzziest of all of the definitions.
It is, and partly why it's fuzzy, and this is actually probably the most prominent objection that's raised, which I do actually sympathise with. They say, well, you've just got a circular definition. And they are right to say that we try to avoid that when we can.
Circular definitions do crop up all
as
the time,
we've
as I
touched
said,
on.
with hills and mountains.
Precisely, but they're normally a couple nodes in.
Yes.
Whereas this one is just straight there.
It's a reference
and
to
people,
something
for some
else.
reason, think that that's a bigger problem. So in terms of optics, it looks bad because they don't see that you've got the same cyclical situation going on with other words.
This is something Forrest brought up with the cyclical definitions things appearing elsewhere. So I just want to tackle this very, very clearly. When you're referencing another thing that then references to another thing and back to itself sort of thing, what you're hoping to achieve is some sort of intuitive recognition of one of those words down the line. So if you were to look at the definition of, say, swift, it'll probably say, oh, fast. Mm-hmm. If you look at fast, it might say, oh, rapid or swift. Yeah. And it's like, you might not know what the word swift is, but you do know what the word fast is. And as a result of that, you've now got a reference back to that initial word. Whereas if your definition of a man is a person who identifies as a man, there's nothing external that you're linking it to get a judgment on first.
I don't know if I agree because the identification criteria would be like basically a public utterance. It's that what changes is that it no longer makes sense to say that someone could be wrong about that or that someone could lie about that, because the only criteria there are is the utterance itself. So that the utterance makes sense as a criteria. You could have a criteria that's like,
but it's not conveying anything intuitive to somebody else.
It's that it doesn't then work. I think that this is where that's coming from, is that kind of reformation of language deviates so much from the way that the words do work, which is where there's content to the concept, right?
Yeah.
And that it's just a completely different type of thing. And now maybe someone could persuade you in principle of that, but I'm just not really hearing why we want that radical, So I'm like, maybe instead what you want to do is say, well, if our current concept of woman involves like motherhood, maybe I want to actually, or not motherhood, but like staying at home and raising children. Maybe I want to challenge that so women can have like more flourishing careers and men take more responsibility. So that's a type of maybe more conservative reform that you might be like, now there's still content to the concept. There's like, I understand that
we've diminished one aspect, but there's other aspects that are still left intact for us to identify with.
But this other, it's almost like if I said, well, what I mean by woman is anything that's I think the way that woman should be used is to refer to my left foot and nothing else, right? You could like that's a position someone could take, but it's like, well, hang on, how are you getting to that from over here? I mean, it's more clear how you get to self-ID than my left foot, but it's like, it's that kind of radical deviation that there's a lot of work to do to get to that kind of reformative position.
I think that's when the motivation comes in, because you would look at that and say, how are you motivated to have this self-identification view? It's not clear until, if you go back to where their foundations are, what you'll see is they don't want to be calling people that identify as a man not a man.
Yeah, I really want to take seriously.
Where do you achieve that? Well, they're coming from a place of empathy. They want to be able to find the best way to achieve that. But if you maximize it, as we've argued here, there's big problems. And that's just in terms of criticism. If you do it in terms of optics, I think you'll lose the cultural war if that gets pushed forward.
The reason I wanted to have this brief conversation on self-ID is this is an accusation that gets levied at you quite a lot in Peter's comments.
It does, yeah.
Because when you were asked, what about this person that doesn't conform to the gender stereotypes, what do you do?
Okay.
And you said, I'll probably just ask them.
Yeah.
So, well, the reason for that is we recognise that there are people that don't conform to the stereotypes. So when we say gender is this thing, is we are, again, we're talking broadly descriptive of society. There are people that fall outside of that. So just asking them is just covering our bases. It's not saying that the only thing is self-ID, but we're recognizing that there's a component in there.
And the thing is the descriptive definition that I gave actually accounts for you not being able to verify that all the time, because sometimes they won't have the phenotype, aesthetics, and behaviors, right? But when it comes to talking to someone else, I can fully acknowledge that they might have a different view to me, and I can just go, oh, okay, I'll use your definition. This happens with atheism all the time.
Yeah.
You'll talk to a theist, and especially if they've been watching apologetics, or if they're into philosophy, and they'll want to define atheism as the proposition that there are no gods. But if you talk to most people that identify as atheists, they just go, yeah, I'm just not convinced by any of it. This is fundamentally a different view of what atheism is. And all you got to do is, if I'm talking to someone and I'm talking about atheism being the affirmation of no gods, and then I realise, okay, they're using it in a way that I would probably describe as more in the realm of agnosticism, well, I would just start using their definition because I'm trying to communicate with them. Because if I take if I work under their rubric, they're right. They're an agnostic, I'm an atheist. Whereas if they work under, well, if you work under my rubric, it would be cashed out differently. So, yeah, it's hopefully that's more than enough to.
On that, just on that last point, it's like here's an actual case that I've experienced many times. Maybe other people have as well, where I have encountered someone where I'm just genuinely not sure how to, like, what gendered language to use in reference to them. It doesn't have to be someone where I'm thinking, are they trans or not? Or sometimes it can be someone who's like very tomboyish or very, or like a really feminine guy. It's like, but I'm not at that point like sure where I'm going with my language, right? So here are how the two views of language will account for that, right? One view says there is a genuine fact of the matter and you should be able to determine it one way or the other. And I think that the other view, the one that we're advocating for, says, well, actually, there are going to be failures of language in some cases because there aren't like necessary and sufficient conditions. There's like clusters of phenomena that we're picking out, and there's going to be cases where there's a kind of like a balance of different clusters that are in each of those concepts, and you kind of try and make sense of it, but you're not 100% sure what the right way is to go. And I think that is a genuine case that happens. And I think that second view makes more sense of that case and the failures of language than the first view, which is like, no, there's just is an objective fact of the matter. And
so just to expand on that, let's take the example of someone who's very androgynous, right? Their essentialist view would mean for them to know they've got to check out if you've got testicles. You've got to look in your pants, right? Whereas our view would say, right, let's use the pronoun they because we're not sure right now. Because that's a neutral pronoun.
I'd probably use they or ask them.
And then if you've got the opportunity, you can ask.
So do you know what their gender is?
Just to clarify.
And sometimes
so it's not saying that then the definition that we're using is incorrect. It's just saying we need some clarification as to which side they sit on.
And sometimes they signal that to you as well. So like someone might be early through transitioning because they want to transition because they don't have to again, right? But like, that's a typical thing that you might see. And yet they wear articles of clothing which is associated with what they're transitioning towards. And that's actually conveying to you pretty much what pronouns they're probably going to want. Like there's just my view accounts for all of this data and makes sense of all this data
in a way that the other one can't.
Or
well, the other one can, but then you're going to be like, in those situations, you're going to be like providing. You're going to be like super rude. You're not going to be inclusive. You end up with.
And so sorry, you've got this situation where, as Peter's explained, when it comes to someone that's got complete androgen sensitivity syndrome, which is to say, if naturally they present as one sex when they're actually the other, he will make all of the necessary movements to go, okay, you're a woman. And yet if it's done
so the definition doesn't even determine the use of the words anyway.
If it's done after the fact, he would then go, I'm not going to do it. Or if I do it, I'm only going to do it because I'm being polite. And it's that. Whereas my view just accounts for all of it.
Your view applies to all the uses of the word. Whereas his view is supposed to account for all uses of the word, but he doesn't really actually apply it in that way.
Oh, the application of it, that really comes in heavy in the second part of this debate, but we'll see where we get there today.
I think that it's important to root these concepts, man and woman, in biology because I believe that a lot of the oppression that people have faced, women especially, has been on the basis of their biological sex and not necessarily how they happen to identify.
So again, we have an emphasis on
that's
identity.
True, but that's not an aspect that doesn't actually contradict anything you've said.
No,
though.
it doesn't.
It's
Because you've
consistent
got
with
the
your-
it's consistent.
because you've got a heavy correlation
Yeah.
with sex. That still applies.
I wish I'd noticed that he kept using identity as a word, because it would have made it. Maybe I should have picked up that he is, for some reason, thinking my view is identity based.
Yeah.
Because that would have navigated some of this space.
So there's this notion of rootedness in biology, right?
What does rooted mean?
Well, I think that's kind of the question that you ask, but you don't get an answer to that specifically. But I take it to mean something like reduced to, like, the more fundamental discourse here is the biological discourse. And I actually think I think that you can see how that. Basically, the problem with that, from a person like my point of view, is that that's not going to, make sense of a lot of these like trans people, intersex people's concerns as well. And I'm like, but I agree that, for example, screenings for cervical cancer, you want to have medical and biological uses of this language and take the concern of cervical cancer seriously, but as seriously as you take trans people's gender dysphoria as another medical concern. So rather than a view that privileges one people group's concerns and excludes the other, it's both, and your definition is consistent with the biological, and so it's that rootedness that you want to undermine. You want to say, no, it's not rooted in biology. And the analogy to, like, parenthood that I was talking about earlier is like, well, you've got biological parenthood. Now, if you're kind of saying, well, because biology is a science and we want to have a scientific point of view, we want to reduce our ordinary discourse of parenthood to biological parenthood. But then
which would be relevant for checking for certain diseases and conditions.
Right, exactly.
But
so there's a moral case to make as well.
So you can keep the biological parenthood sort of aspect.
But where does that leave adoptive parents? Where does that leave step parents? Because these are social. These are social uses of the term parenthood that take place in human social life, but are not biologically rooted. And we want to have an account of language that takes as many people's concerns seriously as possible and accounts for all these things.
So a great example with that is the word mother, right? Mother could refer to the person who gave birth, or it could refer to the person who is helping to raise a child. It doesn't necessarily correlate with the person who gave birth.
Yes.
So I'm losing my train of thought here. So that's kind of what we're trying to do with the gender thing, is show that it often correlates, doesn't always, and can also apply to this group of people. It doesn't have to. You've still got the biological aspect there. It's still there. We're not saying that doesn't exist.
Yes. You also go. I'm sorry. Like in these cases that he's referring to, where women have been discriminated against in certain ways, you're like, I'm taking those cases as seriously, just as these other cases as well. It's not to the exclusion of.
Why is it fair to acknowledge that women in the sense of being female have been discriminated against, but we're not going to worry about the fact that trans people are discriminated against.
And still
Just
now.
why not both?
Why not both?
Why not both? Yeah. Why have you got a privileged one? Like, I mean, when you mentioned about parents, and I think that it might be good to map that with what I think's going on here. We look at the world and we realise that not everyone has for their parents their biological parents, and so I would go. Typically, parents are the biological, parents in this case. Whereas,
the ones who reproduce to give the genetic material.
Precisely. To not use the same word in the definition. But whereas a view like what Collins has is to say, no, parents are the biological parents, and when it comes to the outliners, well, they're actually rare, or they're sufficiently rare to ignore. Now, of course, this doesn't map on perfectly because there's actually plenty of people that have adopted parents, or their parental figures are not their biological parent. But at what percentage do you all of a sudden say, I'm going to acknowledge this? Like, what how does that work?
Well, and if it's a necessary condition, you just need one example.
I know. One example is all you need. But I mean, like, you go back to when gays were pushed into the closet. Yeah. You could have said, actually, when we poll people and we talk to people, it turns out it's really low. Like, if we go to the Middle East now, no one's gay. I mean, so it's so small that we shouldn't really try and adjust our views to accommodate this. And yet the very act of accommodating it and normalising it and going, look, we accept that nature's not perfect. It doesn't do this simple, rigid build. It's always, you know, fractaling, and there's lots of elements involved.
Here's one. Talking of elements, what's it? The most common elements in the universe are hydrogen and helium. They're like 99% of it.
Yeah.
So because they're the vast
the
majority,
universe
the
is
other
fine.
elements are these outliers. There's only these two elements. The periodic table is it's woke.
Well, I guess my view would go there and go, yeah, it's pretty much binary.
Yeah.
But you do have a lot of these other, you know, these smaller cases. Whereas a view that's going to be more stringent is going to go, no, it is binary. We can ignore the other cases.
Yeah.
Sorry, we can't. Like, that's...
Well, the thing is that, in a sense, you can, because you can construct any language that you want in a way.
You can.
But it gets into broader views. Like, so this is where my views, like, it depends on what you're trying to do, right?
Well, this is what Steve's talking about with utility, surely.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of the point I was trying to get back
You can say that there's only two elements in the universe.
Yeah, but why would you do that? Yeah,
true.
That's not going to be very good for like building swords or stainless steel bridges. Yeah, well, because you've eliminated that concept from your discourse, right?
Yeah.
And that discourse is actually very useful for a whole bunch of things. And, you know, you might look at this way of using language in the same way, where you're like, okay, so, you know, you just can't have any trans or intersex people. Okay, you can say that's a minority or whatever, but we want to have a society and world that includes those people. And
but what's the point in constructing our language and society in a way that deliberately excludes people, ignores their very existence? And this is a complaint that trans people have.
Yeah.
You're ignoring us. You're pretending we don't exist.
Yeah.
Trans people do exist, obviously. Stop making things that deliberately exclude them. What are you gaining out of excluding them?
Yeah.
Well, one of the concerns that he brought up there, or at least I think that it's relevant, is, and this is something I've noticed, they say you still need a way to be able to talk about cervical cancer. You still need a way to be able to talk about, well, this is it. My view accounts for that. Now, if you don't agree with breaking it as male, woman, you know, the first being sex, the second being gender, then fine.
How about
use
people
different
with
words.
cervixes?
But this is actually where I think there's a problem, because this is what, like, the NHS is doing, and this is what people do. They go, how do we make it so that it you know, we what for whatever reason.
Oh yeah, there are examples of like someone going for a cervix.
People who give birth, people who can get who have cervix. This optically is a disaster, by my opinion, and the reason being is that the people that are affected by it, which is everyone, because they go to their nurses and they go to their doctors and they're going to see this on the paper. You have
PC gone mad.
Yeah, that's what they say, and it's because they are not engaged with the conversation. And they're not. Whereas you can actually get everything you want out of that just by essentially giving some ground to words that we can already do it with, where no one wouldn't bat an eyelid. If you just said female is the biological aspect and women is the gender part, you'd achieve it without any of these issues. So I think that's worth me emphasizing why I've chosen. Or why at the moment I'm convinced that that's the better way of doing it. It's because you avoid so much of this. You want to make this transition as easy as possible. You want to get people on board as easy as possible. And I've seen it in my day-to-day life. Like, I've seen people that are definitely not transphobic being transphobic because of this.
Yeah, because they feel like the demands are too much.
Yes.
We do need to recognise we are a sexually dimorphic species.
Yep.
There are differences that can pertain to certain health conditions, etc. We need to acknowledge that difference is there in order to account for medication, etc. That doesn't mean that how we act in society is based on that. That's all we're trying to get at, really.
Yep.
Or wholly determined by, maybe, would be. Just
so in 100% alignment with. Rooted.
Rooted in. Yeah, there you go. It doesn't mean it's rooted in to the rebuttal.
And so this idea that a man and a woman are defined sort of, let me see, by what you said, is if they live up to a social construct that includes the biology, behavior, phenotype, and aesthetics of what we consider to be, you know, feminine or masculine. I view this as a regressive definition of what being a man or a woman means, not living up to these sort of stereotypes of masculinity and femininity.
Very briefly, it was.
Sure?
I think that was a flaw in your definition.
I do.
And just to reiterate, it's not that you have to.
No.
It's not a prescription.
Yeah,
Or it
you
wasn't
misspoke.
intended
I
as a
misspoke,
prescription.
Yeah.
First point, and I want to make sure I understand this. Your first point is that the definition should be rooted in biology. Is that correct?
I think first and foremost, yes.
Okay. And then your secondary point is that it's regressive, the definition.
Yes, I believe so.
So quite simply, that's his two objections that he had, and we're going to now be breaking that down.
The idea that the definition of man should be rooted in biology, what is your response to call it?
I'd like to get a bit of clarity, if that's okay.
Sure.
What do you mean by rooted in biology?
It's rooted in the fact that a man must at least be biologically male.
Okay, so it sounds like that criticism is that my view is not your view.
That basically is the number one criticism I'm receiving at the moment.
Yeah. My position is that it's biology. Your position
Yeah.
isn't, and that's what's wrong
Which
with your
I do
definition.
understand that you're going to say, well, my view. I guess if you
Yeah,
wanted
but
to
that's
convey,
not-
it's
that's-
not
it's not a
yeah,
criticism.
Yeah, what's
that
the
needs to be-
conclusion? So the conclusion is like men are always biologically male, right? And then it's like, well, what's your reason for thinking that? Because it should be rooted in biology. Well, why should it be rooted in biology? Because men are always male, right? And it's like, so it depends
funny
on
enough,
that.
that's
Yeah,
circular, isn't it?
yeah.
Yes,
And so
true.
the conclusion there has become like a premise, right? You're dependent. You're asking for a reason. You give that reason, and then you ask, well, what's your justification for that reason? What's the conclusion, right? And so you just got these two claims that sit together. It's like, okay, but why should that convince me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Given I disagree with one.
that first
He doesn't
objection
give you anything.
really is just essentially saying out loud what was already implicit by the fact that you have two different definitions.
But I think the reason it comes up is it's not. This isn't rare. This is really frequent with people that disagree with me. They essentially will tell me, really disagree with you. I'll say, what's wrong with my view? And they go, it's not mine. And that, honestly, that really is common.
I don't think that's just this issue, though. Right?
No, that is, to be fair, that is how it works.
I think people have a very hard time
articulating.
just distinguishing between their view and a view that they disagree with.
Yeah.
So, for example, they'll say, like, this happens all the time in like atheism, theism debate, for example, or morality, something like that, where they'll go, okay, so you've just told me what you think about this, but then, if you think that, if you think that morality is subjective, just as an example, well, then how do you account for the fact that, killing children for fun is always wrong objectively so, right? And it's like, well, that's what you think, but given that we disagree about the objective part there, like, I agree with you that it's wrong, but I don't agree that it's objectively wrong. And so what you're doing is you're creating a conjunction of claims, some of which are mine, but some of which are yours, and you're going, but they contradict each other. It's like, no shit. Like, because we disagree about the thing.
Yeah.
And can understand why he gave that up, but
Sure. But just on the biology thing where he said is all men have to be males, right? It's very interesting because obviously we then get to the complete androgen insensitivity thing, which he brings up later, where we have the example of someone who has lived their entire life as a woman. They've grown up, they had a vagina, they've, all of these other aspects. Society thought of them as a woman, they thought of themselves as a woman. They go to the hospital, find out they have internal testes. Oh, sorry, you're a man.
yeah,
That just strikes me as not only cruel
it's very
to
cool.
do,
Yeah,
but it doesn't seem to actually make sense of it to me.
no.
Because no one is going to judge them as a man unless they tell them explicitly, I have internal testicles.
And just historical data. It doesn't make any sense of any of the historical data on this. Like, so, Virgin Queen Mary could have been a bloke. Could have been. You don't know. And like, the point being is that, no, that she was a woman. That's how she was treated in her society. That's how that works. And this is where I think my view just makes better sense of the historical data as well.
I just find the idea of saying, yes, they're a woman. Oh, you've been to the hospital. sorry, you're a man now.
But Colin agrees with you. He doesn't want to do that. And I was in conversation with Richard
Yeah.
Dawkins
But then they're
on
making
a...
exceptions.
Yeah, and what?
Why
yeah.
not have a definition
what
that
role does the
works?
definition-
I agree, but this is what Richard Dawkins has been doing with the emails with me as well. Like, they just go, okay, well, no, obviously, you know, we treat the case of Jane, which would be an example I've given for, you know, someone with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. You treat them as a woman. And it's like, don't you see that that's illustrating these necessary and conditions that you're laying out are
The
just
thing,
not
what they're
doing the
doing
work.
there is they're saying she is a man, but we'll treat her as a woman. Is what they're saying.
Yeah.
Whereas what we're saying is, why not just say she's a woman?
What, no, but what does it mean to treat someone as? How do you treat someone as if the only criteria for the use of the word is the biological reality, right?
Guys, I'm
So
going to treat this like a castle.
Yeah,
It comes across as contradictory, doesn't it?
because if the term is defined functionally or like socially as a social role, then treating someone as makes sense, right? Because you're treating as implies behavioral change.
Yep.
Yeah.
But if behavioral change is disconnected from the concept because it's only made true in terms of biological reality, then to say that you treat someone as, it just is, it literally doesn't make sense, because you can't, there's no behavioral criteria for treating someone as. They either are or are not because of the biology.
Yeah. If for example, being a woman is female, how do you treat someone as female?
Yeah, exactly. There's the only criteria that you have, you know, your sexual your primary reproductive organs organized to produce a particular type of gamete, right? Like, there's no behavior involved.
I treat you as if you produce eggs. Yeah, that.
Yeah, it's an admission, though. It's an admission that actually the concept is tied up with behavioural characteristics, right? Like, yeah. I mean, obviously that's something Dawkins said and not something Colin explicitly said here, right?
No, but it is an issue with that definition.
You know, in the past about the existence of, you know, the fundamental property of what males and females were.
So, he's speaking from his own perspective here, which obviously he's entitled to do, but it's important to clarify that obviously this is how his perspective views things, which is that for all gendered discourse, what people really mean is, you know, his view, like biological, and it's some essential biological feature, right? And I think that obviously there's an alternative way. So when he said, you know, these secondary characteristics, these would be things that change between cultures and stuff. He says that they're proxies for sex, which his view has to say, because he's saying really all concepts reduce to the biological conception of sex. But I mean, the question to raise is that plausible when you've got completely contradictory things in different cultures? So why is it that high heels in a particular period of time are proxies for female sex, and then but you go back 1,000 years and they're proxies for male sex, Persian cavalry? Like, why is a better account that those things are in fact reducible to the biology there, or is a better account that instead, you know, gender encompasses social roles, and those social roles are historically contingent things?
So it feels a bit ironic, isn't it? The definition is biologically essential, but we make a guess on someone's gender based on phenotype and aesthetics.
Yes, right.
Which is exactly, so he said, we make a guess on your gender based on these things. It's like, right,
well, why
so
not
Steve's
just have that? Yeah, and that's the question. Why not drop out the mysterious underlying thing that plays
you're
no
not
role
using.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, the specific example he gave there is genitalia. He said that if you see someone's genitalia, you can make a really highly accurate guess of what their sex is.
But we don't tend to spend our days seeing people's genitals.
No, but this is where his view would need it so that you have trust in like their parents or their school or like whatever, you know. By school I mean like the preschool, you know, where they're going to be changing nappies and stuff. Like, I mean, it's just such a we don't function that way, and we don't want it to function that way.
One more additional thing to this too is, even if we can say that some people might be wrong in very rare edge cases of diagnosing somebody's sex, this idea that we shouldn't use sort of biology at all blows open the doors to saying that, well, we can just call people who have no complications or DSDs or whatever We might as well call them males or females or man or woman, and it's completely arbitrary.
So I don't know why you threw male and female in there, where you've been explicit on that those are
Relevant
real
factors,
categories,
yep.
sort of thing. But to say that opening the door a little bit blows it open so that the definitions are completely irrelevant.
Yeah,
that's really an unfair characterization of what you've said.
What would he say if someone charged him with that when he doesn't go with the chromosomal definition of sex, right? He said, well, this modification, if we're going to modify our definitions, now you're blowing the door open to anything goes, right? It's like, no, let's just actually have a reasonable conversation about the principled reasons we can give for going with the...
Using his explicit definition there, to most people, if you say, well, this person with a vagina and breast tissue and doesn't have a deep voice and all the rest of it, she's a male. Ignoring my pronoun usage there. Most people are going to go, what? Because they don't understand about the gametes thing and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So what you've got is, essentially, sex is useful as a scientific definition, whereas gender is a more colloquial usage for most people. If you say to someone, this person with complete androgen sensitivity syndrome is a male, they're going to go, what the fuck are you on about? Yes. She's got tits. She's got a vagina. What do you mean she's a man?
Yeah, what do you want about?
And they're not going to understand. Whereas if you separate the two, you can go, right, on the medical side, we can worry about the fact that it's a male. On the social side, it's a woman. I think what you end up with is the definitions that he's giving here and trying to critique you on. Most people aren't going to be using that in their day-to-day.
He additionally just wasn't addressing your position again.
That's the biggest thing for me, yeah.
The idea that biology has nothing to do with... Wait, who said that?
Well, what does recognising a trans person blow open the door to?
Yeah.
What does it actually do in terms of society? It hasn't actually changed what gender is doing at all. Because if gender is based on these assumptions, guesswork as he called it essentially, it's not changed anything. You're still guessworking.
And like in terms of the debate, it really is odd that it's just not my view that's being contended with, despite it being. And I guess it's just he spends so much time dealing with people that just don't hold my view.
Yeah.
Which I can kind of understand because it is more popular to have those kinds of views, it seems, compared to...
Well, I honestly don't even know if it's more popular, though, or because the only real time I tend to hear it... Yeah, it's more broadcasted. Yeah. And I think that this could be a symptom of sort of like the isolated kind of groups of people. Because I hear
think
Peter...
it's a social media issue.
Well, I hear Peter and his guests talk about these things a lot. And I basically never hear anyone actually say that these are their views. And it's almost like, fighting shadows, like tilting at windmills, where they've constructed this boogeyman enemy. And maybe there's a few fringe people out there they can point to from time to time and say, yeah, like, look at this crazy person. But it's that generalization of this, and this is what we're fighting against. It's like,
but that's the thing.
Yeah,
it is not picking, and it's very, very effective, especially in controlling the discourse.
How has the term historically been used?
We could do it this way, right? So you don't know my chromosomes, you don't know, you haven't seen my genitalia, anything like that, right?
Yeah, I'm glad.
Yeah, I'm glad as well, and I would leave you in horror. However, when you meet me, how do you assess my gender?
I don't know. You keep using the word gender, and I promise you I'll get to that.
Well, that addresses literally your question, right? The question is, how do you assess that?
Well, I'll let Colin answer that question.
Again, we have disagreements on like how we view gender.
I'll let Colin do that.
I guess his view would be, I'm a moderator. I don't want to give you anything in terms of... Even though he asked me a question.
Yeah.
I can't answer that because it'll show you're right.
Maybe. But this is actually one of the most important questions of the entire discussion. And that is, how has it historically been used?
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of this in detail already. And I just think that my view makes so much more sense.
I think this is the best question to ask to show that they don't even use the definition that they claim to.
Yeah. There's quite a famous book that I'm trying to remember what it's called that argues that in biology prior to like the 1800s, there was only like a one gendered conception of sex. Thomas LeCure, I think that's how you pronounce his name, in Sex, Body and Gender, and like he provides like a historical analysis in terms of biology, and I think the disagreement's called like the one sex and two sex theories, two models of human anatomy or fetal development, discussed in his book. LeCure theorizes that a fundamental change in attitudes toward human sexual anatomy occurred in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. He drew from scholars such as Aristotle and Galen, so that's going like way back, to argue that prior to the 18th century, women and men were viewed as two different forms of one essential sex. That is, women were seen to possess the same fundamental reproductive structure as men, the only difference being that female genitalia were inside the body, not outside of it. Anatomists saw the vagina as an interior penis, the labia as foreskin, the uterus as scrotum, and the ovaries as testicles. Because obviously there's no theory of gametes, right? LeCure uses the theory of interconvertible bodily fluids as evidence for the one-sex model. However, he claims that around the 18th century, the dominant view became that the two sexes directly opposed. The point is, like, obviously you can challenge this, whatever. But,
I'm not sure about that one.
you can challenge these things, but the point is that, you know, asking, well, what is the historical view? It's like, well, we're talking about thousands of years of very complicated people believing different things, not all speaking English. And that's a big project in itself, right?
But obviously what Steve's trying to get across with a historical viewpoint here is we didn't know about gametes, we didn't know about chromosomes, we didn't know, there's all these factors that we didn't know. So when we were referring to man and woman, we clearly weren't referring to these things.
Well, so I'm going to have to, it's not my view, but you could say people were really referring to those things, but they didn't know they were referring to those things. And I think that that's where what you have to look at.
Well, that's what he's saying with a proxy estimate, isn't it?
But I think that this is where then in terms of the language, what you have to look at is, well, what are the conditions of use for the application of these biological concepts, right? And where are the boundaries on those? And now and call that the semantic range of the biological terms, okay? And now look at, in some particular culture, the semantic range of male and female and what they cover and apply to. And do you get this kind of like mapping between them that's perfect or not? And you might say, well, there's always a little bit of overlap or something, and maybe that's the degree to which you can make that argument. But you have to say, can the degree to which they differ be better accounted for by a different view of language, which is that people didn't really mean those things, but they're just different terms that apply in different
Which
contexts.
is essentially our position. They don't completely overlap. Therefore, what people are doing is making inferences on other aspects. That is what we're saying.
And this is where I brought up the money analogy in the debate and relating to, well, you know, suppose that you got it wrong. All of those transactions, you got it wrong in the sense that the money doesn't have the alloys that you thought it did. Does that make all of those transactions wrong? Can you go and knock someone's door and go, I know that your grandfather gave you the house, but technically money didn't work the way that he thought it worked. Therefore, we own the house now.
Yeah.
It's
But, so, while Peter kind of ignored or dodged or whatever sort of wording you want to phrase on it, Colin does give you an answer of how he knows you're a man. And I think the answer kind of, that was the killer moment. It proved you right.
And you were pretty surprised to hear that he has seen your penis.
I was actually surprised by that. Yeah, he made that inference, and what can I say? He must have followed me into the bathroom.
I would say I would look at you and I would assume that you're male because you have male secondary sexual characteristics. You have facial hair and all this stuff. I can't know 100%, but I can know.
So he makes an inference based on stereotypes.
One, it's stereotypes, which he doesn't. He says that he doesn't want to do, but that he is doing it because that is what's happening.
Very aggressive.
And two, it is phenotype. That's how he's making the assessment.
He picked up two things.
He wouldn't
phenotype and
disagree with
aesthetics.
that, but he would just say that you could get it wrong. Whereas, we've covered this ground. But
But what I want to do with that is he essentially talks about you having this escape hatch. And then as soon as you question him on how you identify you, because you don't get to look at your testicles, he immediately switches to using your definition.
Yep.
So there's an epistemic question right here about what justifies you in using the word, right? And the point is that the idea that the primary sex characteristics play a role is actually an inference, but it's always an inference from something that's epistemically closer, which is the secondary sex characteristics. And so the point is, well, what's better, an account that only makes an appeal to the things that we have more epistemic certainty in, or an account that makes an appeal on the basis of an inference, right, as well. So I think that this is just another one of those aspects where the account that you're providing should be preferred because it only appeals to things that we're more certain of rather than resting on inferences to things we can't see.
Yep.
Even though we're not, again, looking at whether someone has testicular tissue, males and females are still real categories.
The thing is he's just said there, to identify your gender, we're not looking at your testicular tissue. But under his definition, he'd have to be.
Unless he makes
Unless he can make an inference to the fact you have testicular tissue based off of secondary sex characteristics. But
you're doing no better than guesswork at that point.
Yeah, but it's the point that, well, that's kind of what you're sort of saying, right? It's a little bit different, but you're kind of saying, well, the vast majority of the time, yeah, that is what you're actually kind of doing. But then there's just also additional cases that aren't like that too. But
what I'm saying is, what are you doing your guesswork on?
Yeah, the second. Yeah,
you're doing this. You're doing your guesswork on the three things that Steve has put forward.
Right.
So why?
It's not a counterexample to the view.
Exactly. So why not just say what we view as gender is those three things we make for guesswork?
Okay, I think so. So it's like so you've said that we appeal to secondary sex characteristics, and that's sufficient for the correct use of the terms, right? And then he's saying, well, what happens is I appeal to secondary sex characteristics, and my inference to the underlying to the primary is correct, and that's what makes it true, right? But then that doesn't count against your view because you can just drop out that inference to the primary and say someone's still justified. And so it's like, look, that's not all I'm saying is that there isn't that inference to the primary. It's not needed. Normal people in the barista who calls you a man doesn't need to infer.
By cutting out the inference to the primary, he has less potential for making mistakes.
But we're using the same method on the mistake front. What's happening then is we're saying, let's take some of these cases. What do we want to do about it now that we've discovered via your method that our inference was wrong? And rather than saying, well, now that we've figured out that it's wrong, let's make it so that they have to live, or they should live, or it's correct for them to live in a certain way that corresponds with my view. He says, I agree with your view, have them be a woman, or have them be this way.
Well, when it comes to a woman.
No, but for him, it's like, treat them. I know as we've covered, it's basic. What does that mean, to treat them?
Isn't it interesting, though, then, that his view would actually entail more of a self-ID aspect to it? Because...
Tell me more.
If you think of, because he never gets to look at your fucking testicles, he'll make a guesswork and he can be told he's wrong. But he still hasn't seen the balls, so he's still going off of what they tell you.
Yeah, or I guess he could look at, like he said, the secondary sex characteristics, right? So
but he's acknowledged that could be wrong. So if someone he calls a man turns around and goes, no, I'm a woman, he would have to say, oh, I was wrong.
Well,
or he'd have to go present them.
No, I don't think he has to, because I think he could say, based off of like the way that I divide up the probabilities, right? I'm like, your shoulders are so broad and you're so hairy that when you tell me that you're a woman, I just think you're like one of those crazy gender ideologues, and you're just wrong about that. Like,
so what that would mean then is his example later that he complains to Steve of, oh, you might find then a butch woman. He's actually got a worse problem because he's saying...
Yeah, well, how do you do that? Yeah.
Why is that a problem with Steve's thing if you would also do the same thing, if not worse?
Because a lot of the problems that he points out with the descriptive view that I put on the table, I agree with them.
Yes.
But it's just his position that has the same problems and deals with them worse.
Yeah. That's.
And, we currently have sort of our laws in society set up to account for the real biological differences that come with being male or female. And so to subvert that, to flip it on its head...
You're not trying to. Rules on male and female, you're not saying to worry about those. Male and female is different. That's what we've said at the start of this.
My view accounts for...
and he's saying he's worrying to flip that on its head. It's like, that's not what he's trying to do.
And this is also... the claim he made about our legal rules try to make sense of the biological reality, that's such a complicated claim as well. Because the legal... cases that come to my mind are, for example, like maternity versus paternity and divorce. And it's not clear. And again, those are social. Like,
And if anything,
women,
we're trying to equalise
this
so that they're not relevant.
well, this is the point I was thinking. I was like, well, but it's not like it's biologically determined that a woman adopts a certain role in child rearing.
No.
Actually, she could be the primary breadwinner, and they can have a stay at home. It's possible, at
have to
least.
stay at home dad.
It's not like biology precludes this from happening in some way. And
a case of it.
and then what the legal cases are trying to do is take into account basically people's social status, their earnings, and also what's best for the child in terms of and that's not really got its basis in biological reality as such, right? So the claim that in law what we're trying to do is use these biological definitions, I don't think. I mean, maybe there are some
It's
cases.
actually funny in a sense. If you're saying that we should have laws on biological sex, are you not advocating for sexism in the legal sense? Because you're asking for different laws for different people.
I wouldn't say it's. I mean, that's a tricky one. I think sexism is going to be sort of prejudices that are harmful to one group in an unjustified way. So it could be sexist, but it also could not be. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. But
it doesn't seem to be progressing towards a more equal society. Is
right.
the thing that I would say.
Well,
if you're having laws for.
Well, there's something about these gender essentialist views that I think does lead to the way you think about policy and law as being sort of there's basically like inherent. There's a natural order to things, let's put it that way, right? And so things become less malleable in terms of the correct way of creating policy or law because your kind of natural kinds determine like people's status and role in society in a way. Now, he could obviously have a model of that where women are equal to men or something as well. But I mean, that's at least a political worry about these sorts of views generally.
Yeah, because my worry is if you're having this sort of legal separation of men are here, women are here, you're now actually starting to get towards enforcing stereotypes.
Yeah, so when there's a woman who doesn't fit some particular criteria that you're saying, the correct way of characterizing a woman is in terms of reproduction, right? And then there's a woman who doesn't want to reproduce in the same, or doesn't fit in some way. And you're like, well, it's the natural order of that. You get into some pretty weird. You can't. Yeah. I'm not saying Colin does, but there's
potential entailments.
There are people who will use Colin's view, who certainly have those political views, right?
It has many, bad consequences for society. Like most women are biologically female. That's an important distinction. They deserve to have.
It's interesting there, as he said, most women are biologically female.
So he agrees with you.
I see. I got him for saying most women are like he kind of corrected himself because he nearly said the piece.
Could be okay.
But him saying women are biologically female. Well, if you criticize my view, it doesn't do anything.
Well, he's just saying women are women there. If he's just saying that on his view, he's just saying, well, women are women. So.
Whereas if he's criticising me,
rather than criticising you, he's just reiterating his definition.
Yeah.
Because I'm right, you're wrong.
It doesn't give me a reason to change my...
Because women are women, women are not women and the thing you're saying they are.
Which comes to the first objection of your view is not my view.
Yeah,
unfortunately that's a pretty poor argument. That there's not a lot to unpack on that particular.
And under my view, sex and gender are not the same thing. So any concerns about we need spaces for females versus males, and we need to assess people based on their whether or not they're female rather than male, I don't lose that with my definition because I keep sex the category for that. It's a very important category. It's something that we need to take seriously. So say that you go to the doctors and you have problems with your lungs and you're a trans woman. If you transitioned after viralization, after you experience male puberty, then actually it's really important for your doctor to know this. And so that's why it's important that they have down on their notes that you're male, which in this sense would correlate with the definition that I gave.
That's a clear example of how breaking up the language. It doesn't really matter what language you use. You can still make sense of the relevant things to society where we do need that distinguishing element. Which
I think this is a separate. This is again a point about like discourse construction, right? Where discourses are indexed to like things that utility, in your words, like things we're trying to do. And so the medical community is trying to do a particular type of thing, which is, well, what's in the patient's best interest for their health. And so, yeah, like knowing things about their medical history pertaining to their sex, but also having a medical construction of trans and stuff like that is very important for trans healthcare.
It is.
Because, you know, there's all sorts of statistical analyses you can do in terms of, well, this person is now high risk of this because of this. And so having those kinds in medicine, that again might be slightly different from how a biologist in a particular context will think about it, and different again from how an ordinary person might talk about it at the coffee shop. I think they're all relevant uses of this language.
So when it comes to, say, the cervix, one solution that's put forward is they say people with cervix. How do you do this with the lungs? I mean, I know it can be done, but the point is that all of this is just covered if you just say male, female. This is like why the more I think about it, the more I think.
I think there's an additional profile though, because I think like the trans as a medical construction is important, because being a trans person actually is going to now put you at higher risk. Well, it depends which direction trans you are as well.
True.
But being like being trans, if it includes like taking certain hormones, if it, like there's now additional risk profile for a doctor to take into account. But that I mean, so this is where trans medicine becomes a thing. But the point is that it's perfectly legitimate for the medical community to have that information to construct its own kinds. They
need that information. And one of the problems that comes across from people like Colin when it comes to my view is they will say essentially you will lose the ability to have these conversations, and it's just not true.
I don't really know if that. I'd love to find an example, actually, of a trans person who, for example, said, I don't know, suppose that they're male to female trans and they haven't had bottom surgery, right? And they said, oh, yeah, I don't want my doctor to risk profile me for prostate cancer, actually, because of my trans. I don't know, like, all the trans people I know, I think.
You can probably find some, but again, you're looking at outliers.
Yeah, so I think that then, so long as that's going to be most, then actually most trans people will probably agree with their doctors having their medical history.
I'm pretty sure the doctor would turn around and go, no.
Well, this is an interesting point, though, as well, which is that patients don't necessarily get to determine the way that medicine, because what the way medicine is done is in line with what's best for the patient.
Yeah.
And this actually then comes into like questions of treatment around trans healthcare, because if there are things where it's like, well, the best outcomes for trans people are for doctors to prescribe these medicines, then it's not necessarily that individuals themselves get to determine things about the best ways of dealing with being trans, whatever.
So one of my friends is an asthmatic nurse, or a nurse that works in that field, and she does need to know that information because if you have it so that a female has a certain size lungs proportionate to their body, it's actually indicative of something. Whereas in males, because of the hemoglobin in the blood, and especially what happens with viralization, you have a different standard, and so it's actually not something to worry about. This information is critical when it's needed.
So if you're lacking that information, you can be missing a critical diagnosis, essentially.
So my main objection to disentangling whether you're a boy or a girl or a man or a woman from being, male or female, and instead basing whether you're a man or a woman or boy or girl around whether you live up to certain stereotypes, socially constructed roles and behaviors and mannerisms and aesthetics that are associated with being your sex. That is a regressive notion in my view, because this means that if you are not a feminine female, you are no longer a woman. You are instead non-binary, or if you identify with the masculine set of roles, you are now instead of you are a man.
So as we said earlier, that criticism actually applies to himself because he's already basing all of his judgments on stereotypes.
Yeah, and
whereas what you're saying is the stereotypes are not necessarily prescriptive. They're an overall description of how we make the judgment.
Well, there's a lack of, I think, context in those there as well. So they've not been fleshed out in sufficient detail. So on the surface, it might seem like his objection's actually quite smart, because maybe the only, maybe the only examples that have come to mind are like what you might call hyper feminine traits, right? So like dressing in a very particularly excessive, like a clear-cut example so we can all agree. But actually, when you say those social roles and stereotypes, you obviously don't just mean that one clear-cut example.
No, of course not.
You mean a broad range of things. And that broad range of things is going to be fleshed out in full detail, is going to be sufficient enough that it also includes, the butch woman who's so it's like, well, she's trying to adopt masculinity, but there's a degree to that she's trying to adopt some masculine traits, but there's a degree to which both her sex is playing a role there, but also, the way that she's not presenting as a trans, there's a difference between a butch woman and a trans man, right?
Yeah,
and that difference is that there's like a feminine presentation of masculinity sort of thing, rather than the attempt to present solely as the male gender role and everything like that.
Well, the other point is it makes sense of something like dysphoria. So if you've got a trans man, trans woman, whatever, that are trying to identify with the other sex, they are, a trans man might get a mastectomy, they'll have things that allow the facial hair to grow and things like that. So they're trying to find ways to conform with those societal expectations. That if those societal expectations, again, you don't have to say you have to stick with every single one of these, but that is what we're doing gender. That's what they're trying to find a way to conform with.
I think the point here as well is that it's like the behaviours and dispositions too, they're continuous phenomena, and like there's a boundary somewhere, but actually, like where you put a particularly butch woman and like a particularly feminine trans man, like, someone who's quite feminine but is transitioning to a man from female, like actually that border is going to be incredibly thin at a certain point, and that's all right because it's a continuous real phenomena that we're trying to put a boundary around, rather than like a discrete category where there's clear joints in nature that we're getting at here.
Can I use an example on here that might help with? So take the colour spectrum. So you've got red and purple.
Yeah.
At what point does red stop being red and become purple?
That's a good one, yeah.
So you're trying to find the place along that line, and it's just fuzzy all the way along.
Yeah, right.
And what we're saying is there are ones that we consider to be more masculine and more feminine.
And now you're describing a spectrum.
And now you're describing a spectrum. You don't have to be fully red or fully purple, but we're making a judgment of, oh, you're more purple than red, so you're probably a man.
Yeah.
You're more red than purple, you're probably a woman.
And when you're talking about several factors, such as phenotype, aesthetics and behaviours,
it's not just
how do they
two-dimensional.
intersect? Use a word that will shut people off. Intersect. How are they intersecting? What's going on here?
Sorry, I've obviously painted a two-dimensional.
Whereas actually, it's a multi-dimensional fuzzy line. It's a multi-dimensional. So it's even more than three. So how do you even represent it? But it's multi-dimensional fuzzy space as well. It's not like multi-dimensional clear. But to loop this back then to the accusation of, well, it's regressive. Well, the reason it's not is because it does account for these cases, right? This is
acknowledging it.
This is an explanation which grants the butch woman her womanhood and the feminine trans man their masculinity. It grants both. So it's not regressive in saying if you don't fit into certain stereotype. It's not saying if you try to adopt certain stereotypes that you don't fit, because it takes into account that intention to fit into a different stereotype. And
so what it's doing is it's making a little bit of room so that we can have both people fit into where they feel they should be fitting into, rather than drawing a hard line in the sand and saying, no, you're delusional.
Taking into account both of their public presentation, but their intentions too, and all these things together.
I really don't understand the calling it regressive unless you're fixated on this. You must conform to a stereotype.
Well, it seems like a really smart kind of judo flip type move, because it's like, well, your concern is to be morally progressive, that's why you're pro-trans, right? Whereas now I can accuse you of being regressive. But I think that the claim that people in the past were more progressive really is contradictory, because the idea of progress in itself is the morality that we have moved towards over time, right?
Well, it tends to be recognising that we might have been wrong on some things and that we might need to make room for things.
And so,
for example, gay people.
So the sense in which there's progress, I think, is a temporal notion where it's more aggressive in the past and more progressive now. So I think that's what progress means, like this temporal notion of moving towards something linearly through time. And so to say that people were more progressive in the past, to me at least, is a contradiction in terms. Like
yeah. I guess by him he means he would do regressive in terms of its efficacy, in terms of its moral.
Can I give an example of something I consider regressive?
Sure.
There are in the States like schools that are having dorms for black only students.
Yes.
Now they're reintegrating segregation disguised as safe spaces. Now that is something that I would consider regressive.
Okay,
in a sense.
See, I wouldn't call it disguised because it like, but I do think in any case,
I'm not trying to use.
Okay.
No, I agree. I agree.
So this would be a case of we're reinstituting something in the past that we recognise as bad.
Yeah.
No, you're right. You're right. So maybe we would be better swapping out the claim of progress for better, basically, right? Or morally better.
Yeah,
and we say that I think that your view is morally worse because it's more stringent. It doesn't respect people's like liberties as much as something like that.
I think that's a steel man of what he's trying to say.
And then the sense in which it's a false claim, though, is that when we historically look back at the way that people use these terms in the past, they were less respectful of people's individual liberties and
they
choices,
were more
and
focused
more
on stereotype.
prescriptive. Yeah. So Stephen's view that he's put forward is one that's very tolerant towards people's decisions to not conform and to modify what those stereotypes are.
Are you going to tell me the 1950s definition of woman is more liberal than what Stephen's going across?
Yeah, it's just not well, one thing that I'm recognising watching this again is that when it comes to his objection for my view being regressive, on the one hand, he wants to say that I'm essentially enforcing stereotypes. And we've packed out why that's not the case. I'm just saying describing that, you are, in most cases, going to see these stereotypes coming up. And it's going to become culture specific. But then he also would accuse me of being regressive because I adhere to self-identification. And that is a contradiction to saying that there's any attributes at all. So it's like two mutually exclusive objections he's giving to me.
Yes.
And if one maps on, the other one necessarily can't.
Yeah.
And there's some kind of confusion or mixing of wires happening here.
And this has real implications. So I specifically look at things like gender affirming care and things like that. They will say that if you're the gender that you identify with, so the roles and behaviors and norms and stereotypes, if that differs from what is typically associated with your sex, then you have a mismatch between your gender identity and your physical body. And this is causing kids to be confused about this, and adults.
What he's saying is, if you look at someone and, Steve says that he likes pink, well, I've now got to treat him as a woman. That's what he's saying.
Yeah.
And it's like, but that's not what we're saying, though, is it? It's not what we're trying to do.
It's because what he said at the beginning. He said self-identification again, which just isn't my view.
Well, it's not even that. He's saying that your thing of it's this prescription aspect again. Mm-hmm. He's saying if you hold to any of these stereotypes of the opposite gender, we have to tell you that you're trans.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know that's. I don't know if that's exactly what he's saying. If it is, I disagree. But in the to the degree to which he is characterizing, for example, like WPATH's health guidelines around like transgender care, right? Mm-hmm. I think that like a functionalist characterization of gender, and then someone experiencing gender dysphoria as like a kind of dissonance between the roles that they want to inhabit and how you might functionally characterize, the different genders. That is one of the like diagnostic criteria for being trans, but it's not. The way that it's actually
the end of it, though.
You don't know that's it.
So that it's not sufficient that you experience that just once or something. Like it's like a kind of systematic, prolonged over time, over multiple different aspects of your life.
Therapists and there's just going to be so many other factors.
Well, I forget exactly how the criteria are worded, but there's kind of there's 4 or 5 criteria that are written out, and it is it's something like a persistent, prolonged over multiple. It's not just like experience likes pink or something,
because kids do that. Right?
I think he's saying this as a reductio though of your position. So
he's saying if under your position,
this is
if
what
a kid starts experiencing or adopting a stereotype of the other sex, then you have to declare them trans. I would actually say it's not a reductio. I would just call it a straw man.
Sort of.
He's attempting a reductio, but it's a straw man in the sense that he's not really working with what I've put on the table.
Well, I think there's a sense in which what he's saying is right, but it's ambiguous because it encompasses both cases where someone is trans and where someone isn't, right? So he's not specifying enough. So there's a sense in which that disconformity of someone's, the roles they want to adopt and the roles that they sort of have been adopting due to what they were being socialized into, that when there's a mismatch, that is the criteria for being trans, right? But what he's not specifying is the degree to which that has to happen to consider it like a genuine medical case of transness. He's presenting it as if just what... So there's a sense in which it is a legitimate criticism of the view, but it's a maximally uncharitable criticism, because once you unpack the degree to which that would be required for someone to be trans, it doesn't sound so ridiculous anymore. Like if it's just like, yeah, well, on your view, as soon as Timmy wears a princess hat, he's trans now. That's crazy. Like, you don't want that. It's like, well, I don't want that. But as soon as Timmy's putting on a princess hat every day for 5 years and he starts wearing dresses and makeup and he's always hanging out with the girls, all of a sudden I'm like, maybe there's something going on here.
Yeah,
like,
yeah. I think that's probably the right way of doing it, actually. Yeah, he's attempted a reductio and come up with the most uncharitable version. Yeah.
There's something wrong with them. A mismatch means there's something wrong. But then we have this medical apparatus that says, well, this mismatch can be fixed with, giving these sex non-conforming kids hormones and surgeries to make their behaviors and stereotypes make their bodies match the behaviors and stereotypes that are, associated with their type of, their internal degree of masculine and femininity.
And this is where you were saying about, no, it's about a prolonged situation.
Yeah, there needs to be a more rigorous investigation.
I swear, like you should watch it on Fox News. They seem to think that like a kid will go, oh, did little Timmy pick up, the tutu? All right, hormones now.
Well, here's the thing, isn't it? If you want to criticise the fact that there's organisations out there that have acted too rashly, surely that's a fair criticism.
Yeah.
But to say that that is implied and required all the time is unfair.
Yes.
To say that sometimes organisations either get it wrong or they push too hard, fair. To say that you must do it this way, that's not what we're saying at all.
It's maybe I'm going too far with this analogy, you tell me. But it's like saying, look, some people need chemical compounds, antidepressants, let's say, in order to be able to live their lives. And what I want to do is make sure there's room so that we can do that. And then someone's coming in and saying, no, under your view, someone's going to go, oh, I got up on the wrong side of the bed today. Okay,
yes.
You're immediately sticking them on drugs. And it's like, no, that's not how that works.
I actually think that is a fair analogy.
Okay.
So, other thing, I'm on antidepressant drugs, right?
Yes.
Because I have prolonged and persistent
I don't mean to
problems.
bring it up for that reason.
No, I'm fine with it. Yeah. Because I have prolonged and persistent issues with my mood.
Yeah.
If you have a bad day, you're not going to start taking the medication
No one's going to come up to me and start going, right. And there's not like a problem with our society because we go, listen, some people need some help. That's fine.
If you had that low mood for 2 months,
then it's starting
then
to
we might have a look at, right, is something going on here?
And what if it was chronic? What if I had it for years and I've tried therapy and I've tried things like that?
Yeah.
All I'm saying is that you've got to have room to go, all right, there is something going on with this trans thing.
Yeah.
Let's make room for it.
I think you've actually done quite a good analogy there. Sorry.
So what I've been trying to find on my phone, not just rudely ignoring you both, is what is in like the WPATH guidelines. So I've not done like a super rigorous search through it, but
it's a quick search.
But for example, when you read like so phenomenology in adolescence, in most children, gender dysphoria will appear before or early in puberty. However, in some children, these feelings will intensify and body aversion will develop or increase as they become adolescents and their secondary sex characteristics develop. So even just in that sentence, there's a characterization that's like, it's this prolonged.
That sounds to me.
Time.
Let's look at some initial indicators and then keep an eye out.
Yeah, it's
Which
not.
is
And then
exactly what they do for mental health.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah.
Let's look for initial indicators and see if it continues or develops and gets worse. If it does, Now we know what route to take them down. If it doesn't and they stabilise, then we've got no involvement.
And look here, so it's like roles of mental health professionals working with children and adolescents with gender dysphoria, directly assess gender dysphoria in children and adolescents, so that's as they present, provide family with counselling and supportive psychotherapy, assess and treat any coexisting mental health concerns, refer adolescents for additional physical interventions to alleviate gender dysphoria, educate and advocate on behalf of gender dysphoria.
I'll stop you here as well, actually, because before it said anything about worrying about the actual gender dysphoria, it said address other mental health concerns.
Yes, yeah.
Because those mental health concerns could be having knock-on effects.
Yeah.
So if we address those first...
And what do we do with depression? What's your exercise like? What's your diet like? Have you been, consuming enough water? What's your vitamins? Do you need vitamin B?
All I'm trying to say is the order in which they've listed stuff here is important.
These are of higher priority.
Deal with this first, deal with this first, deal with this first.
But even within that, you've got like a whole category here called fully reversible interventions as well, which it's recommending before partially reversible interventions, before irreversible interventions.
So those steps to take first to check.
So none of this is like basically, Timmy chose a pink toy, so now
cut his dick off. Which is the indication that they're going with, isn't it?
Yeah.
But sorry, I don't mean to be blunt like that, but that is what they're saying, and that is the straw man that gets put across quite often.
But that's perfectly consistent then with the criteria in terms of social role and everything. And it's like, well, there's a mismatch between the social role and someone's perception of it, and then we continually investigate that in certain ways, and through increasing degrees of intervention and
So this is now part of the conversation where you're addressing their definition rather than dealing with the objections to your definition. So obviously, back on the table is the adult human male. And adult human male. Female.
Yep. And we're going to go into what my objections were and just break them down and elucidate.
Okay, so it sounds like you put across 3 conditions that must be met in order to be considered a man. The first is adult, the second is human, the third is male. So that's correct, right? All 3 of them you must have in order to be a man. Is that fair?
Yep.
Simple clarity, that's what the view is. And we know this is where people normally will say a woman is an adult human female.
Yeah, and obviously there's only 2 there that we have objections with, because the human one is like, we've got to be a human if we're talking about...
It's one of those ones that I could object to, but I just don't see the practicality in it. Does that make sense?
I'd so love to hear your objections to the human, but it's not worth it.
It's not worth it.
It's not worth it.
It's not worth it, but I actually still think it's just as complicated as any of these. But
yes, that's my point. It's
there's
just
stuff to unpack.
Not the place to go. Much of the same problems that you'll find on the other 2 will also relate to, but it's just not worth it.
There's a lot of
optics reasons that I gave you.
There's similarly. There's similarly complicated problems in philosophy of biology around species and taxonomy and things like that,
course,
right? Basically,
and that's what I'm getting at.
But the 2 we're focusing on are adult and male/female.
And just so everyone just remember that simple answer, great, but how confidently he said So if there's any caveats, any...
the way the confidence that he did that with suggests that there should be no exceptions.
He didn't say I give you that as a shorthand, but it's more complicated than that. He just said
Yes.
If I can show you that one of your criterions is a social construct, would you agree that renders your actual view a social construct?
I would say it depends. I would need it here.
So I think it's worth expanding on what I'm getting at there. What's generally argued is that my view is a social construct, which I say it is. Whereas if you say adult human male, it's not a social construct.
It's scientific.
Scientific, yeah. Whereas I'm saying here, if I can show you that one of the 3 criteria that you put on, or I think I can do it with 2, but if I show you with 1 that it is a social construct, how does that impact your view? Because if you say that your view is scientific, but actually one of its pillars is a social construct, there's actually quite a lot of concern that you should be having with that. And that's what I'm trying to get across beforehand.
Especially if his critique of you is that it is social and not essentialist.
Precisely.
Then if you're both dealing with social constructs, then we are talking in the realm of which is more useful.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's like that you don't get the problem with your view is that it's not as rigorous and scientific as my view. But then it's like, well, are all the features of your view rigorous and scientific in the same way?
And I can understand why he was reluctant to answer that. One, because of clarity, but two, because it sounded somewhat like I was phrasing it as a trap, which to an extent it is. It is. I'm trying, but I'm pointing out the trap, and I'm saying if I can show that your path walks across that, we agree that your leg's caught. And so it's not hidden or anything. I'm just saying I'm going to walk you into it.
You're not doing it in like a sneaky way.
No.
It's that you think that this is actually a genuine tension for the view, and you just want to make sure you get there step by step in a way that's unavoidable and as clear as possible.
First of all, I have concerns that are of an epistemic level, so how we figure this out, and then I have concerns about the ontology of it all.
So just before you go into those, the issue I had here listening to you guys debate the first time was you've asked him about the social construct bit, but you're setting that aside to deal with later, and you're now actually going into a different aspect.
Yeah, it would have been better for me to
because the social construct aspect is adulthood, whereas what you now start dealing with is the entailments of basing things on being male or female. So in terms of the debate structure, you might have been better served dealing with adult immediately after the social construct.
I agree. I would have been the better bet to do, and I'll do that in the future if I have these conversations.
No, don't change your mind.
That's not allowed, is it? No. We don't change our mind over in the woke corner. That's true. Probably worth breaking down what I meant by, epistemological concerns and then ontological concerns. And it's getting to, say, the bathroom example, where you might want a certain view to be upheld when it comes to bathrooms and segregation there. You've got the concern of what's actually, happening. Like, how do you determine whether person X should use room A or room B? But then you have an additional problem of how do you verify that? Like, how do you ascertain that knowledge? How is it that we have a document of this? And both of those are two separate concerns, or they can be viewed as separate concerns.
You're actually building on what he had said in the first portion of the discussion, where he said there should be legal status for men and women.
Yeah.
So you're actually building on, right, okay, so what's the entailments of those legality aspects?
Yeah, so like the ontology part, I guess, would be saying this is the way that it is. And then the epistemology would be, how are you figuring that out? How does that happen in our life? Like, what methods, what situations do you set up that can help us verify that information? But yeah.
Or maybe even, so to phrase that, I think that epistemological concern is like very strong. Like, you've told us this model of ontology, how you think things really are, but what's your story for how people know that when they're using words in this way?
How do we
that
live
seems
by
to
it?
depend on secondary sex characteristics, right? So you seem to agree that we use secondary sex characteristics in all these cases. So what's your account of what's going on there when people don't make appeal to gametes, or even people who didn't know gametes existed? Like, how do they in some sense know, or what's the... I mean, I'm not saying there's no ways you can do this. I think you can say, well, no, these are the real features of the world, and there's, a language that approximately maps to that, and you can get into... Then you just get into, like, deeper and deeper, like, problems in epistemology, philosophy of language, whatever. All views are going to have some of these problems as well, right? I mean, it's not exclusive for his view, but I think that is one way that you can make more plausible sense of what's going on there on this rival model of it, which is that actually all people are doing is appealing to those secondary sex characteristics, and I don't need a model that makes appeal to any of these additional entities, right?
Where you would say gender and sex are about this specific thing to do with testicles. In the case of being man/male, it's about testicles. When it comes to the structure of society, such as bathrooms, are you saying the bathroom should be segregated based on this? Or
So I just want to pause. So we have not developed, so Reed put on gender, which is one of the words I would also want to do, but we have not gone over that. Would it be helpful to you if we did gender now, or do you want to continue with the line of questioning?
So Colin, correct me if I'm mistaken, but because Colin's view of gender being so closely associated with sex, in fact, sex is a necessary condition. If I'm ever talking about sex,
The point to raise here is kind of like, you know, you've got a clear line of questioning which is raising problems for Colin's view, and then Peter, as the independent moderator, is helping you out by throwing a spanner in the works and raising like like, look, if you wanted to talk about something different, you probably would say something different, and maybe the reason that you're saying this is because you want to talk about this.
This actually did happen a lot. I do think, you know, it seemed to me that Peter was doing his best to make the conversation flow in a way that... well, you could say what he's doing is trying to get it so that it flows in a way that everyone can follow. But I actually don't think when it came to me criticising Colin that it helped.
Well,
I
the
actually
thing
felt like it
is,
peeled it off quite a lot.
He would only interrupt your line of questioning.
I know, yeah.
So there's...
And it's difficult to say that that's deliberate, but even if it's not, it still has the effect of making like one interrogation kind of like, it's like, oh, the problems are mounting up. Whereas then when it goes the other way, it's like, oh, we've kind of forgot what we were talking about.
And that definitely is the result of what happened in the conversation. I mean, like, just to be straight with you, I wouldn't have sat down with Colin with Peter as a moderator.
If you had known that.
Oh yeah, it seemed like you were having a fine conversation.
Yeah, I would have been fine with Colin. Like, I might even say, Colin, come on again. Let's have a conversation. It was fine. I genuinely was thinking, okay, I'm going up there to talk to both of them. I wouldn't travel to London to sit next to Peter as a moderator. With respect,
You could have done that
I would have just
online.
done it online.
Yeah, right.
Because Colin wasn't there. If Colin was there, I would have done it.
I think that segregating bathrooms according to sex makes the most sense.
okay, cool. So that means that's consistent. I can see that. Now, here's one of the problems I have. How are you going to enforce that?
So I think I think there should be laws that should be put in place for that, or at least a social agreement that, you know, an individual who is clearly biologically male should feel out of place in there, and there should be a major social taboo over doing it. There should also be a legal...
On the social taboo side of things there, if you've got a trans man going into a male bathroom or a man's bathroom, or a trans woman going into a woman's bathroom, what's the social taboo being broken? They're there fitting in with their gender to go to the toilet. The social taboo that he's sort of concerned about is this potential for a sexual assault, but we've already got that social taboo. So changing up things to allow for trans people or intersex doesn't actually alter anything there.
Yeah.
And not to mention, obviously, the fact that you're assuming that people who are trans or intersex are going to be sexually assaulted.
I think that's where
horrendous.
any kind of coherent concern like this makes any sense, or at least to the degree that he speaks about it. As I raised in the conversation, he doesn't do this with gay people. He doesn't say, look, gay people obviously attracted to the same sex. So when a man goes into a bathroom and there's a boy there, oh my goodness, like there's a predatory element. We would just look at this and say, frankly, that's gross. And what's gross is just thinking that way about people. And yet we're at the stage at the moment where people will say that about trans people, and most people will say this is a legit concern. And it's like, oh, there's just so much wrong with this.
But on this sort of thing of, oh, we do it by a social taboo. What is the dress that Muslim women wear? That burqa, right? What's to stop a man putting a burqa on and going into a woman's bathroom now?
You wouldn't be able to tell.
There isn't. You wouldn't be able to tell. And what are you going to do? Tell them to take it off?
And he said about stereotypes, right? So he's saying your view's regressive because you're running on stereotypes. What's he going to do? Just follow some butch woman into the bathroom and then?
Yeah. Most people using the bathroom want to either piss or shit. Those that are there for
cocaine.
Those that are there for cocaine or for assaulting reasons. Doesn't matter what laws or social taboos in place, they're already planning to violate them.
Yes.
Well, this is, it's like, well, we've made sexual assault illegal as well. So, there's an interesting.
I'm
you're right,
not being
yeah.
stupid there, right?
No, you're right.
If they want to violate the social taboo, they're going to do it, whether or not there's a law in place.
If you had someone that was going to do something,
Someone who's going to rape someone is not going to care about the law of.
They're not going to go. Oh, I would, but you know.
But there's this extra law.
They're already breaking the law.
There's a
on
gender
rape.
toilet law.
What's the point in having the
gender toilet law?
Yeah. So that aspect of his concern there just feels utterly pointless to me.
Yeah. In fact, what they would do, like if someone was being predatory like that, they would stick on clothing or articles that disguise themselves because of phenotypes, of aesthetics, and because of behaviours, something that he recognises in his view as well, and then go in and do whatever they're doing anyway. Like it doesn't achieve anything.
So the only way you can enforce this law and this taboo that he wants in place is to have people stopping you at the door to check your ID or check your genitals.
Yeah, you want to go? Yeah, all right, well, boy.
So there's a pragmatic philosopher whose views I kind of endorse called Hasok Chang, and he says he calls his view realism for realistic people, right? And a quip he likes to make is that when people are realists of a very particular essentialist kind, the kind sort of like the type of position that Colin's advocating for, well, they just have the most unrealistic accounts of how like normal life and reality work. And so, and I think you see that as soon as you ask a question about how to operationalize his theory here, right? So he's kind of built a theory based off of kind of almost like armchair philosophizing, really. And you ask, well, what's the connection between this theory and
this practical example,
and real life? And it breaks down instantly. You know, he says, well, we need a social taboo, and we need laws, and we need it all becomes the stuff.
But how are you doing it?
If we watch it play out, he gets incredibly tangled.
And it's like, well, what is the role now that's being played by your biological truth makers? Nothing. All the things you appealed to were the features of my model that I'm saying gendered language is really about, right? And I think that that's because you just have a more realistic, workable conception of these things. And whereas his is sort of like, you know, it's a nice model. It sounds clean.
Makes a good sound bites.
Yeah, exactly. but it's completely unrealistic.
This really speaks to where I see the entire conversation, and that is that you have quite a lot of people very confidently espousing this view, and you just scratch the surface. That's all you got to do. Like a really simple question, a really simple scenario, and it just falls apart, like immediately. And yet they
start using your definition without realising
very quickly, yeah.
And I think that we're about to see a very good demonstration.
There should also be a legal, component of that as well, but it is admittedly very difficult to enforce. But I think there should be a case where, you see someone who looks incredibly male that you should be able to go and talk to a manager about that.
That point.
Do you want to, that is regressive.
That's regressive.
Well, it's not just that though. It's what does it mean to look incredibly male? Like, does he have chromosome vision? Does he have gamete vision? No, he means the secondary sex characteristics. And he said this, I forgot in the clip before as well, someone who clearly looks male, right? But you can't, perception is, he's applying his theory to his perception there about which is the conclusion that's being debated, which is that my ordinary attribution of masculinity, manhood corresponds to gender, but actually he can't guarantee that inference in he sees the secondary sex characteristics and goes, well, that's man, right? But then he's like, and my definition of man is the gendered one. So that depends upon the inference from the conclusion. But really, all he's got is the secondary sex characteristics in terms of what he's justified in and appealing to.
What you've got, ironically, is, right, it needs to be based on this essentialist view of gender. So it's biology. But I'm going to judge a person on the stereotype of whether they fit a man or a woman.
Right.
Now I'm going to go to the manager and say this person doesn't fit what I expect to see in the bathroom. And then what's the manager going to do? Pull them out of the bathroom and ask to see their ID? Under the accusation you're actually a man, not a woman, so you shouldn't be here. How humiliating would that be for someone?
The thing is, this right? I want to go to that descriptive, prescriptive, unless you You still going?
Oh, I'm still going.
Oh, you still going?
Because I can't imagine something more humiliating and degrading than being dragged out of a bathroom and say, I need to see your ID because I don't believe you're a man.
Yeah.
But
Right.
how would you want to handle the case where, you know, like that case we kind of agreed to of the person with the huge breasts that's kind of doing there's something weird going on. Like, suppose you see them going to the female bathroom and doing, like, acting kind of sketchy. Like, how would you handle that?
You're now picking up if they're acting sketchy.
Yes, that's right. So
you didn't do it based on how they looked. You're doing it if they're sort of watching someone.
In my opinion, kind of like there are certain ways someone could, like that, dressing like that in particular with the really large fake breasts and like clearly being biologically a man and going in. Yeah. I'm not sure if it would prompt me to want to get involved, but I would definitely make a judgment that something sketchy.
You can make a judgment, but what I don't want is the way he's put across there is you are going to start enforcing stereotypes by law because anyone who doesn't conform to a stereotype is now at risk of arrest.
Yeah, well, I'm not making that inference, but I'm saying it doesn't have to be that specific case. But suppose there's a case we agree, because there are cases we agree to where someone might be a pervert or whatever.
Sure.
Right. But how would we deal with that other than like getting the manager involved and like reporting it or something? Like there's got to be.
But what you're doing there is you're normally picking up on a way that someone is acting. We've got they're acting suspiciously. Someone just going into a bathroom isn't necessarily acting suspiciously.
No.
So I don't want to make judgments on that. If you've seen them following someone down a road and then they turn into the bathroom sort of behind them, now you can start questioning.
Yeah, you probably wouldn't. You wouldn't based off of the
not
look.
Just how they look, no.
Or even if the look is sketchy to you, it's not sketchy enough to justify getting the manager or police.
Normally, I'm going to be judging off of behaviour, not the fact that their phenotype doesn't match what should be in the bath.
But I think it's so. I mean, say if there's someone who's like trans but doesn't pass very well, and like they go into a bathroom following like a little girl or something, I'm going to be like, whatever. But then if like someone who's got like the huge crazy breasts and it's and is like clearly overly sexualized, it goes in after a little girl, I don't know if I'm like, I don't know.
So is that a case though where you might just decide to wait outside for a period,
and maybe I won't
see
get the
what
manager
happens when they come out?
Yeah, maybe.
And then if they come out and they're still following them,
it's
now,
still difficult.
Now I might.
Maybe what I'm acknowledging is just that it's still difficult how you would enforce it. Yeah.
Of course it is. Well, but what I have a problem with is the way he's prescribed it there is he's turned not being a stereotype into an offence, essentially.
Yeah.
Because people can now check you for ID because you don't conform to what society expects you to look at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know why. I'm just thinking if there's a similar story that's told of, people that don't have white skin or have like brown or black skin being pulled up at airlines because of like some association. We tend not to be a fan of that, and yet there's a mapping here. Two things. I really like pushing it to what do we do with these situations. The first thing we can do is, because it's going to be a very rare case, we could take a page out of Colin's book and just ignore it.
Yeah.
The second thing, and the more serious thing, is suppose someone's doing it in the same-sex bathroom.
Yes.
So, you've got a man and he's being creepy. Oh, yeah, and he goes into a male bathroom.
Oh, yeah, it's not the transness that makes it...
It's got nothing to do with
trans. You're right. The question is, how do you deal with someone being creepy around kids in a bathroom?
And once... and once you've like...
It's not a gender-based
once you're working with that, it becomes very clear that this concern has nothing to do with...
Yeah,
it's just
nothing to do with this. It's like it could be to do with that in this case, but the practical question of how exactly is unrelated from the trans issue in particular, because it's like a false accusation is always really harmful and
and it's going to be what they do, right? So if people come out that toilet and they go, there's someone in there being strange, that is the thing that's justifying the concern. That is what justifies the intervention. That's what justifies the...
Not, there's someone in the bathroom who looks a bit too much like a man.
Precisely. So by my lights, as soon as you just make it so that the dude's going into a male toilet, you realise actually it's really...
Well, otherwise you've got this really sort of bigoted viewpoint of they don't look how I expect them to look, therefore...
Yes.
Well, that's what I wanted to say. It's like, how do you draw the line between people sort of maybe having dissonant feelings because of someone not passing and someone who's like genuinely a pervert and trying to, like, and I think that there can be a difficult line there, because again, it's not discrete phenomena. It's kind of like...
Well, here's the thing, right? On the women's bathroom front, a trans woman is going to at least be attempting to pass as a cis woman, yeah?
Not in all cases.
Not in all cases, but generally speaking.
Yeah.
Whereas if you saw me going into the women's bathroom, now it's a bit more sketch because I'm not even making any attempt to look like a woman.
Well, this is where it gets a little bit difficult though, because maybe there are going to be trans women who are more butch trans women, and you're like, well, how do I like?
What you have is, so the extremes are obvious.
If you use your colour,
blurry line.
You're a red, right?
Yes.
So you are going to get into that middle ground. Be like, I don't know if it's red or blue.
So the criticism, because I don't think there should be gendered bathrooms anyway. I think we can kind of do away with them. But
if we can,
if we're sticking with gendered bathrooms and we're making some legal sense on it, I can see an argument for bold guy with beard, big shoulders and all the rest of it. He probably shouldn't be in there because he's wearing my clothing type and all the rest of it.
Well, here's a point though. I don't see how anyone's definitions, like mine, yours, or Colin's, is helping us resolve any of this. Anyway,
it doesn't.
None of the definitions are helping. It's instead like, what the fuck do I do? Yeah.
Well, there's another thing here, because I know where you said about let's do away with bathrooms. One of the criticisms I've seen is people go, oh yeah, we just changed society. Yeah, we've done it a lot of times before. Like in America, for instance, they went, you know what, we're not going to segregate things anymore. All of a sudden there's two fountains. No, there's one fountain. Like, it can be done, and just looking at it and going, it requires infrastructural change. Yeah, who cares?
I have been to plenty of places now where instead of two different bathrooms with things, it's just individual doors. Yeah. No problem. No one has any issue with that.
No. You might find a dude outside triggered because it says, we don't care what
because they've listened to 10,000 hours of podcasts. Like, I can't get away from it. It's like, dude, just listen to a nice podcast instead. Like,
again, though, the problem he's got on here is he's trying to pick some extreme, the ultimate rare case to discount all of it, rather than accept that for 99.9% this covers it, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And any solution you come up with that's going to deal with in this case the predator going into the same sex bathroom, so he goes into the boys' bathroom, it's just going to work for the other way around as well. It doesn't matter. Yeah. And if there is any issues here, it's not clear that his view does any better of a job of dealing with it. And if something impacts both views, it's contextually irrelevant.
Like I said, I could wear a burqa and go into a woman's bathroom and no one would question me. What's it? You know, it's not got around to dealing with any problem of potential predation. No, like I say, is all it would do at best would force stereotypes onto people. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't adopt the stereotypes, now you're at risk of being pulled out by the manager, ID'd, or arrested. And I think that is, if we were to implement his view there, it's about the worst case we could go, the worst way we could go.
Okay, so there's a lot there.
I think it's largely done through self-policing because there are certain social taboos and just respecting spaces that, are supposed to be designated for one sex or the other. I mean, there should be a legal component, I believe, as well, where
But there already is a legal component.
But you get what he's doing here. There has to be a legal component, but we can't enforce the legal component because it would be too difficult. So we need to go with a social taboo thing, which is based off of a gender expression, not their biological. Do you see how tangled he's getting?
But if it's done by self-policing, well, on my view, you can have self-policing.
Yes.
And if you go, there's problems, there's problems on yours as well.
Yes.
And if you want to implement any kind of solution, it's going to look pretty damn abhorrent.
Yeah.
His solutions to the problem would actually be far, far worse than anything
worse.
we can come up with.
Yeah.
My point is he's flip-flopping.
Yes.
He can't hold to this position because he knows it can't function.
And this is what I meant, but you just got to scratch the surface. I just went, let's go for one thing that your definition's going to have a say on, such as bathrooms. And immediately, it's like, well, it needs to be legal, but there's no way that we can do it.
To do it would be very invasive, so we need to judge it off of their aesthetics. But we can't judge on aesthetics because that would be stereotyping them.
Yeah.
Well,
it's not regressive when I do it.
To them and say to them, actually, you look like you probably don't belong in that bathroom, but it should be self-policed. So I shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, you're right. I don't think you should be there because you don't fit the stereotype, but you're the person who's meant to look after that,
Yes,
not me.
Yeah.
But, oh, God, man.
It doesn't work.
I think this was one of the moments where I started sort of internally laughing because it was just, he can't hold to his position and he knows he can't hold to this position.
Does he know? Does he think that what he's saying is coherent?
I think there's a way of making it work, right? And the way of making it work is like, well, none of this undermines the fact that this is what woman and man actually are. It's just that, there are these epistemic and practical problems. But it's still the only time that it's true that this person's a man and this person's a woman is when, they meet the criteria that I've offered. But yeah, it's just how do humans like us figure out how to integrate that with practical situations in law? Well, appealing to secondary sex characteristics and it's imperfect, but it's not inconsistent with the view, it undermines it. And then I think that what you do is you compare, well, how does that look compared to the story that I had to offer, right? And it's like, well, I say it just is those things. And then when it comes to the pragmatics and legal cases, well, we use the things that I appeal to in my definition for the pragmatics. And so you don't need the additional assumption of stuff about gametes featuring at all in anyone's inferences or thoughts or in the actual world in inferences. And so there's just less assumptions on your view and you can say it's better, but better fits with what we think is going on whenever we try to make any practical sense of how we operate with gender and And
there's like an example that's going to come up in a moment about complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. And he just says, okay, we have to make an exception.
Well, now you've got,
whereas
under
my view,
your definition...
No issue with my view.
Under his definition, he's now let a man into a woman's bathroom.
But it's rare, so we can ignore it.
But why is he let them into there? Because he's judged it on a stereotype.
But even when he's found out the information, he still says, let them use the bathroom. And that means it... I mean,
it's not consistent with his own viewpoint.
But to hear me go, listen, these minority cases does not invalidate the general principle. But
why?
He says it as if I don't have that already in my view. And I do have that in my view. But I just also don't have that problem.
You don't need to make the exceptions because it's already counted for.
Yeah.
I guess the question, why does he accommodate those exceptions?
That's what I'm saying. It's not consistent.
But why does he, what would he say to that? Like, why accommodate them? Is it like because I want to be nice or... My view is that the reason he wants to accommodate it, and the reason why Richard Dawkins will accommodate it, he's verified that to me in email, and the reason why even Thomas Bogardus did it, right? I think what's going on is because my view is correct. And actually, this is where they are getting to the bedrock of their intuitions, and they know, okay, I know this is the right thing, not just morally, but this is correct in terms of the way that gender plays out in society. And then you will come up with a story of why to justify it afterwards. And this is why you're asking why, because it's not well motivated, unless it is the case that they're operating on something that I think is correct. Correct, of course, I mean...
The reason his intuition says that you should let someone with complete androgen insensitivity go into a woman's bathroom, it is that intuitive sense of that. And it doesn't matter that his definition doesn't cover it. He recognises that there's something else external to his definition.
Yeah, that's it.
He doesn't want to recognise that there's an external
in the
to
definition.
That definition.
Yeah. Well, he doesn't want to build... But this is where he can't have his cake and eat it too, right? Because if his definition is supposed to be providing an account of gendered language...
It's essential.
And this is a case of a correct use of gendered language, right? well then he has to have an account that accommodates that too, and he just doesn't. So his explanation just doesn't fit the data, whereas yours does, and so that's another reason. So we had the reasons in terms of parsimony and assumptions that the different views make, but now we've got another kind of like virtue that your view has over his, which is it fits the data better. His doesn't fit all the data.
If I'm in a women's bathroom, just standing there, going to make a lot of women uncomfortable, I think I should be able to get arrested if I'm just hanging out in a women's locker room, watching people undress or whatever.
So if you notice on the example that he's given there, is nothing to do with actually how he looks. It's how he's behaving.
Yes, it's all behavioral.
He's just standing there watching women undress.
It should be illegal. Voyeurism should be illegal, whatever. Not voyeur. What's it called? When you're peeping Tom. Right. Isn't voyeurism when you like people looking rather than when you are looking? I don't know.
Either way, we know what you're saying is watching people without their consent
is not okay. Already.
It's the behaviour. It's not phenotype.
It's nothing to do with how he looks.
Yeah. It's not. It's got nothing to do with sex. It's got nothing to do with phenotype.
Because, for example,
behaviour that we don't want in any bathroom. If he did that in the men's bathroom, I'd report him.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Because what I was going to say is if he shaved and grew his hair out and maybe had breasts and he was doing that, that would still be a problem.
Yeah.
Not for me.
It's got this. Well, we've covered it. It really is. This isn't a problem that is specific to.
What he's described is predatory behaviour.
Yeah,
the
no one wants predatory behaviour.
I think that this highlights one of the points that we raised right the way at the beginning, which is like why this, like in terms of our substantive disagreements, why are we focusing on this biology definition stuff when it seems like our disagreements lie like outside of that. And that actually this is almost just like a completely different conversation that has very little to do with where we actually disagree or any policy decisions or anything. It's just kind of like a random little game to play about definition.
All of the disagreements seem to be on social entailments.
Or just being there and undressing myself and minding my own business. I think I should be able to be forcibly removed from a place like that. So, What
about you, Stephen? Do you think that people should be able to just sexually assault people and not be...
Apparently my view entails that that's perfectly okay. I've got no way of dealing with it. It's just...
I mean, he hasn't explicitly said that, to be fair, but from the way he's responding, it sounds like the implication is, like, I prefer this view because I want that, and I can't get that from your... But, like, what's his view got to do with that, and how does your view not allow you to do that?
Also, an aspect of... I feel like there's some misdirection in what he's done here. Because what he's done is he's given a condition of, I'm clearly a man, and I'm in the women's bathroom looking at women.
Oh, yes, right.
Therefore, trans women in the women's bathroom
the same situation.
Shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
And it's like a false analogy sort of thing. Yeah. You're not equivalent to the trans woman in the bathroom just being there to use the bathroom. No.
And under my view, he's not a woman by the descriptive element of it.
But what I mean is he's playing like a misdirect there, in the sense of, here's the thing that's so obviously agreeable. If you can agree with this, now everything should be bad.
So to be overly charitable to his view, right? If he is correct that there's this one-to-one correspondence between sex and gender, well then a trans person, say who presents as a woman, just is a man, right? And so there actually isn't a relevant difference between him being in the toilet and a man who presents as a man going in the female toilet as well. On his view, there isn't a relevant difference. And so I guess
you mean a man who presents as a woman?
I mean, there isn't a relevant difference on his view between a man who presents as a man and a man who presents as a woman going into the... Well, when I say relevant difference, there isn't a relevant difference in terms of the concepts of man and woman. So I think you could still say, well, there's a relevant difference in terms of one of them presenting that way. It doesn't make them a woman, but actually the psychological, like there's not a sexual intent there, or there's less likely to, or what, again, how do you handle then, like, gay men predators when they're in, it's still problematic, the idea that it doesn't give you everything you want still. But that's the way he's thinking about it. It's like, it's clear cut because I draw this one-to-one category between sex and gender, so it doesn't matter how someone presents. It's the same as just a man walking in there and now feel outrage at that intuition of just a man going into and that's doing all the work.
He's got this intuition that all males going into the woman's bathroom are going to look like men.
Yeah.
And it's not true.
But not just the look like, it's like the almost like there's a certain intent there. So if you paint,
he's describing a predator.
Yeah, he's trying to get you to infer from a case where it's like just a bloke walking in, and you're like, yeah, obviously he's trying to look at their boobs, or whatever. And then the kind of like inductive generalization there is like to a trans person as well, like to do the same thing, because it's not different if they're trans, because they're still a man based on my definition. But it's like, no, hang on, stop, think about it a bit more. There is a relevant difference. The difference is that this person's trying to adopt that social role, and they want, so there's.
But can I just bring an example of something today that's just making me kind of laugh that he would essentially ban? Is I've been to places where the queues for the women's toilets were huge, and obviously the men's are empty. And what was happening is some of the women from that queue were just starting to go into the men's bathroom and use the thing. I can't imagine making that illegal.
Yeah,
it's a case of they need to use the bathroom. They go into the bathroom, do the business, and leave again.
Yeah.
I've also had situations where I've been at a restaurant and for some reason the male toilet isn't working.
Oh, yeah.
And so I just go, can I use the women's? And they would say yes, because they're using it as just one toilet at the moment.
Yeah.
And yet that would be illegal. Illegal.
Well,
Because the restaurant wouldn't be allowed to change it. So what I want to do is get to the adult stuff.
I mean, yeah, we're not checking people's gonads at the door when they walk in there. But we can make very reasonable, extremely accurate assumptions that are almost always going to be the case. Where if you see me in a women's bathroom, I mean, I should be forcibly removed. I shouldn't be, having to whip out my my testicles and for them to see whether or not I should be removed.
But why not? If it is based on your sex, how are you allowed to judge someone on their appearance?
He would say the inference is being made because of the other characteristics.
So he's basing it on the stereotype.
He's doing it on the phenotype, yeah.
So what he's got is, I want my definition, but I don't want to use it in the social circumstances.
He's saying it's not necessary to use it.
He's saying he can't.
If he grants that the stereotype correlates to his essential biological characterization, then I don't understand the sense in which it's wrong to appeal to those secondary characteristics as part of the primary concept as well, because they just are, right? One reduces to the other. And so it's kind of like saying, if temperature is mean molecular energy, well, then it's wrong to talk about the temperature. You should only talk about mean molecular energy. You should only talk, because if womanhood properly understood just is actually always referring to those chromosomes, well, then all of the stereotypes are reduced to that in every case. And so there's nothing wrong then with appealing to those stereotypes as, okay, the stereotypes could be otherwise, they could be different stereotypes, but it's still true that they do in our culture and so on, reduce to those biological, so it's not clear where the resistance comes from in the definition.
That's kind of what I'm trying to get at, is he wants his definition, but he doesn't want to use it socially. And if you don't want to use that definition socially, why not adopt a definition that can be used? Because he's already explicitly utilising the things that Steve has said.
Yeah.
Phenotype, aesthetics, and behaviours. He's already explicit. He's just told us that's what he's going to judge it on. So why not just say that's what gender is?
Well, I think it's because he wants it to be like it couldn't have, that sense of inevitability, right? Like there's something here that doesn't change and underpins it all, and it's natural. And I
think the fact that he's a biologist is creeping into his biases, essentially.
Yeah, but not all biologists think like this as well.
No, I know.
Well, he's been calling the establishment woke because they've been moving into. At least I think he's been saying that. He may have not called them woke, but he's certainly been criticising them for moving into, say, bimodal views of sex, because they are changing their mind on these things.
Well, accounting for intersex, yeah. Anyway, I think that's enough on bathrooms and how you check for someone being male or female. He's told us you're not going to do it the way that he would have to do it under his worldview.
Yeah, let's round up on adult.
Let's have a look at adult.
What is an adult to you? What are the conditions to be an adult?
Yeah, so biologically speaking, an adult is an individual who has reached sexual maturity. Now, again, this adds up a little bit of nuance when we're talking about humans. So even though biologically speaking, we're adults at around, 13 years old, we've sort of agreed as a society that we have something called like a legal, whether you're legally an adult or not.
So that clip, even though biologically speaking, we've agreed on what a man is, socially speaking, we've,
social construct.
The justification, so his view, previously he mentioned that terms ought to be rooted in biology.
Yeah.
Why does he think that when it applies to man and woman and not to adulthood, right? And if it's possible to, in this case, not root it in biology, but instead have the social concept as something that comes apart from the biological concept, well, why not do that in this other case as well? Why? So in terms of consistency,
that he has, because the way that he defines man and woman is, if you will, maybe it's not the right term, but it's parasitic on how he's defining adult. And if adult has that feature, so does his definition of a man, at least to some extent.
He's got the uncomfortable conclusion that there's potential for a 10-year-old to be considered an adult.
Yes.
And therefore you've got woman at...
Well, I think the crux here is that he's inconsistently applying this semantic reduction thesis, the idea, and this like scientific rigor thesis. Like, I think these are the two core parts. So he's inconsistently reducing things to biology. What's the principal difference between when we should do that and when we shouldn't? And I don't think he has a good answer there.
I think it's when it makes him uncomfortable.
Yes. And then the second thing is scientific credibility. So in what case ought we reduce things because it's scientifically credible, and when shouldn't we, right? Because in this case, he's more than willing to grant the legitimate status to the legal definition of adulthood, even when it diverges from the biological status. And he's not going to say, that's woke and unscientific. I care about reality and science. And
when he says like it's rooted in biology, it's what he's going to want to say, and what he does say is that when we hit 18 years old, let's say, this is a time when the brain is done with, so much developing. It's when the bodies went through so much developing.
It's an average that society has agreed on as a rough.
But how is that rooted in biology at this point? Like, you're using it in a very weak sense, because he's right to say that, well, it is true that you will generally hit like these levels of maturity around this point. But that's just an arbitrary aspect. Like, if you wanted to choose adulthood, why not 25 when the brain's finishing, right? If you've already said we're not going when you're sexually active, choose the end of puberty is one way to do it. You could choose the end of brain development in another case. And with his criticism of saying that my view is not rooted in biology, well, it is rooted in biology in exactly the same way that his is.
Well, I think the way he's
socially agreed upon average.
The way he's viewing adulthood here is, there's a very tight analogy to the way that you're thinking of like male and female, right? In the sense of, it's like, well, there's a relationship to the biological reality of the organism's development, right? That is playing a role. And then there's kind of like the societies in which we're based, and legal constructions and rights and responsibilities, and the statuses conferred socially. That's also adulthood. And the two are interconnected. Like, you will find that the development of the organism correlates very heavily with where societies put, But you can't say a necessary condition is that, because, sometimes you're going to have rights that societies, like maybe in France or whatever, you can drink at, I don't know what it is, like 2 years old or something. It's not that, but yeah.
Isn't it interesting? We can have a biological sense of adult and a legal sense
of adult. Yeah.
Why can't we have a biological sense, and then gender is a legal sense of what sex is?
And that's the point, is that he's borrowing from your worldview. No, he's basically applying the same standard that you apply in the case of gendered concepts to adulthood. And the only thing you're doing is just taking a consistent approach, right?
Yeah. That's how it feels to me. Yeah.
Your dog doesn't have a legally adult. It's just the strict biological definition of what an adult is. And that's because, we have a society of laws, and we can decide that.
I mean, do we kind of think, I don't even think about adult dogs. I don't know. I mean, there's a sense in which, yes, but
it's kind of, the thing is it's not really relevant to our society, so we don't base anything around it.
For sure.
His point is that with a dog, we just look at it and we go, okay, so with a dog, what happens is as soon as it can reproduce, it's an adult.
Well, I still don't think that's what I'm doing, though. I'm just like, it's kind of big now. I'm not actually... Yeah,
The thing is we don't have questions on mental maturity when it comes to
We don't
dogs.
we don't care about them enough to like, or
they don't play a role in our legal system.
That we need like
Well,
some
we've
kind
got no
of
way of understanding the mental maturity, really, have we?
to some extent, you know. Do they get the ball? When do they figure out when you throw that ball when it's still in your hand? Adult. That's it. You know, it's an adult.
I've never had a dog that did figure it out.
Oh, then they're not an adult. Okay, done. You know, maybe my definition is regressive.
Because there's, I know you've mentioned it already, but he's only brought up strictly a reproductive definition of adult,
and his,
but we also have the mental aspect, because there is another definition, even in the dictionary, that says an adult is a fully mentally developed being.
yes.
So it's like, again, he's only picked one of the many possible.
Well, this is that basically, again, once more, we're finding that there's a load of different features and perspectives for looking at the way that people do, in fact, use the word. And it's very difficult to just reduce it into this, like, really simple essentialist characterization in terms of sexual reproduction.
But isn't this the point?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I think the social construct development of adult is the one that we tend to use. For example, you know, like in Japan, a woman is an adult at 16, whereas in other cultures it might be 21.
Yeah.
Or in other cultures still it might be 13.
But I think we actually sort of apply it metaphorically to animals. So, like, for example, in the case of pets, and I think pets are probably even different to wild animals again. But like in the case of pets, when you talk about, if you ever talk about your pet being an adult now, I think you probably take the social legal sense that you understand adulthood in humans and apply it metaphorically to the way that you sort of anthropomorphize your dog, and rather than, I mean, maybe dog breeders.
It's normally at some point
never
during
considered
its
adult dog.
Yeah, I know.
Big dog.
Well, but this is kind of what I
it's
mean.
the big,
though.
isn't it? Like you see that it's got big now, and you go, it's basically done its puberty.
But this is what I mean, though, in terms of if we're engaging in describing how people actually do use words. I don't think that this is a very good thing to appeal to just go, well, you know, when we talk about adult dogs, we mean sexual reproduction. Like, does that actually happen? No, like, I don't really
How many
think.
people do we actually
What he would
discuss?
say is people that are interested in reproducing them might speak of them in this way.
Yeah, but
Or like,
that would be like
Yeah, but they'd
saying,
say-
oh, people talking about biology will talk about
And that's
sexual
fine.
Yeah, but I
People
think,
do
but I
that,
think
yeah.
they'd say like she's a mature bitch and stuff like that. you
yes,
know?
yes,
Like,
yeah, they would.
But isn't that kind of, again, another indication is when you go into specific fields, you will have specific definitions.
yeah, and the
we're
question
talking
is
about broader society, not specific
and the question is like, do those, you know, do those uses of language like map in this perfect way to those like more ordinary senses? And when I think about the cases, at least that I'm aware of people maybe using adult to refer to pets, they're like, oh, he's my adult boy now, but he'll always be my baby, talking about like their pet dog. But the sense in which they mean adult,
They say adult. Would they say he's my big boy?
well, mate, but I'm not even sure. But to the degree I can even really imagine it, I think that they're just metaphorically applying the normal social sense we apply it to humans, rather than they're like making a biological claim.
What I think you'll find when it comes to other animals, it will be they're grown up.
Yes, yeah, right. Which is also the sense in which we use it socially for humans, though.
And how vague is the term grown up? There's no definitive point on it. And we use that with, you know, sort of in your mind, if I was to say, oh, they're a grown up now, you sort of equivocate that to being an adult. But it's not.
It might not mean they're legally an adult.
What's the correlation?
Yeah, and then you go, what? So you can join the army at 16, but you can't have a drink, you know? Like,
exactly. Yeah.
But he brings up dog, and he's saying that, you know, we just look at dog and all we're really getting at is this reproductive element. And we've unpacked why that probably isn't the case when we're talking about them. But he says in humans we don't. Now, the first thing that is of concern is, should we do it? And
well,
he
I
doesn't
think on his
want
view,
to do that. He wants the social construct.
Well, you bring up precisely why we probably shouldn't.
Yeah.
With Aisha.
But if we're taking Colin's kind of like presuppositions and things that he applies when talking about the gender case, well, we probably should actually, because they're gonna. If you want your essentialist view, yes, then he should. But it's more scientific.
It's very uncomfortable saying that Muhammad could marry Aisha at 9 because she's an adult.
This is the whole reason I find this view untenable, because we look at it and we go, does society run this way? No. Do you want it to run this way? No. Well,
why is it true?
Why
because
is it
I hate
true?
trans people,
Yeah,
okay?
like,
I hate them and I can't give them a word.
It's like I don't know what else you need. Like this to me was very much the point where it's like, it ain't the way that my intuitions thought it were. That's it. It's done. And then, I've watched Colin, I've watched Peter, I've looked at other people, Helen Joyce, etc. And I'm just like, they're not contending with this.
I'm sorry.
And, there was that sucks. that was something else. I'm gonna have to invite her on the podcast. That'd be nice. So I just think that this is such the way I see it, this is a game over point for this
He's acknowledged that we use a social construct
and wants to do it. It's done. All right, so we want to move on to another comment that Colin made, which is to do with exceptions and what roles they should play in our thinking on this matter. We've covered it already, but there's more to be said. So let's play a clip of him talking about exceptions and the way that he sees it when his view has exceptions as opposed to my view. Because when it's my view, we know that he said it was a trap. It was an escape hatch. Yeah. But let's see on his front.
But I just want to push back against it. Just because there are exceptions to something doesn't mean that it's totally arbitrary. Okay, it's there can be fuzzy borders on things, but we can still say that in the overwhelmingly vast majority of cases, there's just no question.
So the thing that is interesting about that is he said he doesn't include chromosomes in his definition of male and female because there are exceptions where that doesn't happen. And now he's saying, well, there are exceptions to things that make things a bit fuzzy, so it's fine to keep my... So it's again, he's not consistent with his viewpoint.
Because he said there's an extremely tight correlation with chromosomes and male-female.
So it's nearly always the case.
Why is it in this case that he's decided, even though there's an extremely close correlation, we have sufficient reason to drop it?
Well, here's the whole disagreement is, well, why do you not say that those exceptions include trans people?
Yeah. Why?
Yeah.
I mean, have your definition then. Yeah. Why not include trans people as
if he's
in those
exceptions?
Percentage.
If he's happy to have exceptions in other areas, why are they not counted among the exceptions? Yeah, exactly. It's just time and time again we see that he can't be consistent on his worldview, whether it pertains to sex and chromosomes, whether it pertains to age and how we use it in a legal sense, whether it pertains to utilising laws on checking whether people should go into bathrooms. Every single one of them, he folds. He can't hold a consistent viewpoint on them.
And it's basically holding my view when you push it hard enough.
Okay.
I'm gonna ask a question. So one thing that I wanted to ask before, but I didn't want to interrupt Stephen's line of questioning is...
So at this point, Peter wants to
helpfully
ask a question. Yes,
interrupted a line of questioning to start his own,
and so
which, as a moderator,
so
Peter's maintaining his neutrality, not intervening, and helping out by changing the topic.
Yes. So what we did is we moved on to a question from Peter, and that's what we'll address next.
You want to do, and this is why I'm so interested in the utility concept. You want to root these words in biological reality, as opposed to borrow a term, utility. Is that accurate?
I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. I think biology should be what they're based on, but again, there can be some blur around the edges. So
again, it's sounding like he's coming round to your view here. Or, well, maybe this was his view initially.
Are
still,
trans people not the blur around the edges?
Well, exactly, right? This is exactly the case, and I think the guidance Peter was giving there was to put this emphasis on, like we said, there's a few components to his view that might motivate people towards it, and it's like this emphasis on the scientific aspect,
biological reality.
So the biological, but also the reality aspect and the objective aspect, which are like fact, certainty, all that kind of stuff, right? Being a part of the view as well. What's interesting is that Colin is kind of like, oh no, it's more complicated than
These are facts, these are objective, they are reality, but they are blurry.
But And
we'll make some exceptions, but others we won't.
But also, it's not like if you took your view, right, you would say, okay, so given your view being correct, are there biological facts? Oh no, there aren't anymore. Of course there are still. It's just
And even his concern with the routing, right? When he's saying, is it rooted? It is. We've
Well, if rooted means
if you use rooted in the way that you use it when you're talking about it, then my view is rooted in biology.
If you want rooted, what you're using is heavy correlation.
But this is where
this is where
I think an equivocation is
yes.
almost being played out. I don't think it's necessarily conscious.
It's ambiguity.
But it's the ambiguity in rooted. And so when he says rooted, what people are thinking is my view is biological.
Yeah, why doesn't he use a scientific term rather than a metaphor? For
Yeah. But when pressured, it turns out what rooted means is that it's largely associated with. It's typically associated with. And yet when it comes to my view, it's your view's not rooted. No, it is rooted. If you're using it for you like that, I get to use it like that, and it's rooted.
Almost your view is upfront and honest about what you're judging on.
Yes.
Yeah, well, it's that realistic thing, right? It's like, well, it's like, I'm realism, I care about the real entities, but it's completely unrealistic account of whereas yours is like, more like the realism with a human face kind of thing, where it's like, actually, reality is kind of a bit messy and complicated. I really do affirm that biology is doing stuff in the world. And
just to emphasise again, is Steve's definition isn't saying, let's get rid of biology.
No.
Yeah.
It's saying there's biology, and then there's a social aspect.
Because
that's all it is.
Yeah.
It's like what he expects is to be able to come up to me and say, by your view, it's just a coincidence that so many people that are female are women. And I'm like, it isn't.
Yeah,
it just
not
isn't a coincidence
at all.
Why is it that way?
By being a social construct, you're saying it's completely arbitrary.
That's not how social constructs work.
Well, unless you want to say all of language is completely arbitrary because definitions are social constructs.
Well, I think
this is a problem. There's an element where it's true.
There's a sense in which it's this charge of arbitrariness is again vague, right? So it's like, well, it is arbitrary in the sense that it could have been otherwise, right? But it's not arbitrary in the sense that anything goes.
Yes,
there are actually reasons why it is the way it is, and those reasons
but that's
like saying it is based on something else.
Yes.
But this is like saying contingent means arbitrary.
Yes, exactly.
And it doesn't. Not in any
and that's why
sense.
I say the thing about inevitability, right? For the social, for the essentialist views are like it being the way it is inevitable. Like the thing Peter's saying, anchoring, objectivity, and what the construction does is it undermines people's certainty in some kind of status quo, and that's where the disconcerting aspects kind of come in for some people.
I'm wondering whether or not there's, again, an analogy to be drawn with, say, how many digits we've got. Whether or not it's arbitrary that we've got 4 fingers and a thumb. There's a sense in which that is arbitrary, but it's not. Not in the way that most people are talking about it. It's not just random.
It could have been different. Like we could have had 6 fingers and a thumb, and then you have a slightly different ecological niche that's selected for that.
Is it arbitrary to say most humans have 4 limbs when there's people that don't?
Yeah. In the same way, it's just it's the ambiguity of the term arbitrary, and it's potentially meaning anything goes versus its meaning could have been otherwise, but there are reasons.
And this is really the crux of where I just find so many criticisms of my view, because although I'm criticizing his view, he's phrasing it in a way that's getting at my view. They just don't make any sense or have any relevance, because it's almost like they haven't paid attention to what my view is, or I've done such a poor job of articulating myself that these just aren't issues on my view. And if there is something that impacts me, it impacts that view as well.
But that's the road the moderator's not intervening and not leading it up. Is like this dichotomy between, well, it's either objectively anchored to reality or it's anything goes.
Yes.
And it's like, well, it's not anything goes. It's anything could go in. It's things are up for grabs, but they are the way they are still.
Yeah.
And
it kind of reminds me of the discussions on morality, where like theists will go, either God has made it so that this is wrong.
Yeah.
Or it's random.
It's either God wrong or we kill
because
children.
say that morality it's rooted in evolution.
Yeah.
It's not arbitrary. It's not arbitrary that a social species loves its neighbour.
Yeah,
that's an important
inevitable
thing.
Yeah.
But it is contingent. Because do snakes have that? No, probably not.
Yeah.
Why not? They're not a social species.
Yeah.
You've used the word a few times, like biological reality. It's something that would enable an independent adjudicator to come in, like someone from Korea, someone from Swahili, whatever, Swahili, wherever. Is that the impetus behind this, or have I got that wrong?
Yeah, something that's independently verifiable.
Okay, so the argument that Pete is trying to make here, which is in favor of Colin's view and against yours, and he's making this obviously as the independent moderator, is is that there's a preference for Colin's view because it provides some kind of criteria for correctness of use of the language, right? Whereas yours doesn't, because anything goes on your view. But I still don't think that that's right, because just as long as there are criteria for the use of the word, right? So imagine someone comes along, they point at this table in front of us and they go, that's a woman, that's a man. Well, we all as competent English language users say, no, that's incorrect, because there are conditions of use for this word, which are... So maybe maybe this is part of the problem of the definition you gave at the start, not stipulating anything about the kind of criteria. The criteria. What are those stereotypes? There, and obviously it gets complicated because we're combining a lot of these different kind of parameters in different ways. But so there's going to be difficult cases still. But the point is that there still are criteria too. It's easy to point to those cases that are wrong, and so there is a criteria. It's just that criteria is grounded in the use of language by the social community, right? Rather than it being grounded in an eternal natural truth that carves nature at the joint. That's it. There's still independent criteria, right? If a person who speaks Swahili but isn't from Swahili comes along, they're learning English on Duolingo, they get a flight to the UK, and they start going, cool, I'm learning English. Here is my woman, and they hold up a cup. You might go, oh, hang on, I think you've misunderstood how to use the language. You wouldn't go, oh yeah, you're right. I'm woke. Anything goes. So this kind of argument that Peter's offering, where he's like, well, you can do that, Colin, but he can't. It's just wrong. You've both got criteria. They're just different criteria.
But again, it's funny. Is I'm picturing this independent adjudicator that's come over from Korea. It's like, right, so I need to judge it on adult human male.
Yes, well, there's that as well. Yeah. That's like, have I got it right?
What's the independent adjudicator looking at?
But don't stop.
And then we're both there going, no, there's a social construct element. Can we get it to about 18, please?
Yeah. Give it another grab. Hang on. I'm not sure if I'm a man yet.
What is this independent adjudicator going to look at?
Yeah.
Or grab?
Yeah.
Again, to suggest that yours is completely independent of anything would be to ignore the definition you've put across.
Yeah.
There's the point is just
they're arguing against self-ID.
And the point. Well, I think that maybe actually the angle Peter's going is he's trying to say that your views, like, it's anti-scientific, it's unfalsifiable and stuff like that, because that's why he's talking about criteria of verification, right? But there are still criteria of verification because like your views emphasizing what people actually do, which are all publicly observable things, and you're like, well, when it's those things, it's it's the correct use of the language, and it's got nothing to do with like hidden inner essences that are inferred but don't actually aren't observed and don't play a role in what people actually do. I
mean, suppose that we were talking about adulthood, which is, of course, relevant to this discussion, especially with the way that he defines gender. And Colin and I have agreement where we're basically we're both buying the social construct of 18. And then Peter says, well, let's bring over, someone to mediate from the Middle East. And they come in and go, you're both wrong, it's 13. And also I have this biological imperative that feeds into my view.
Yeah, I have an independent criteria.
It's also like, what would we count here as someone that's suitable to come across and do it? It's going to be whoever already has their view.
Well, this is a problem as well, right? Yeah. But, so within the notion of independent criteria being offered by Peter, there's like the broader almost assumption that there's a shared mental criteria of the concept of womanhood that isn't like a kind of culturally contingent concept where the connotations and use, so maybe there's this one-to-one correspondence even between like different language words for woman or whatever that might not be quite right. It get into a whole complicated mess trying to really figure out what we think would actually happen with this exact analogy. But I think the point is that there isn't this asymmetry where, oh yeah, because of this point Peter raised, that favours Colin's view and your view doesn't have an answer to it. It's just the same for both views. There's a criteria on Colin's view, there's a criteria on your view. And actually the criteria on your view makes more sense because the person probably is never actually going to make an appeal to anyone or ever even see a gamete or a chromosome. Well, I mean, obviously not, but or maybe never see a reproductive organ, maybe if they get lucky. And whereas on your view, that they're going to see all of the things that they actually use to learn how to use the language.
Yes,
like,
yeah. If it just makes more sense of that diverse cultural content as well as the historical content, it's just
the criteria are unobservable entities on his view, whereas on your view they're observable.
They're observable, and that's how they're making the sense.
I just don't know the utility of organizing society around like the extremely rare exceptions as opposed to like the down the fairway. This is what is almost always the case. Starting from there and counting for exceptions rather than trying to like count for exceptions first to blow up the entire system that we have.
But does that apply to your chromosome thing?
Well, what's he actually referring to here? Like who is saying what we need to do
start with exceptions.
Is revise our law and come up with a general theory of exceptions and then handle the main cases. Like people are just saying there are some legal cases that involve trans people and now we need laws that
the implication of what he said is we start with trans people and then we work out everyone
on your
else's
view,
gender from that. And it's like, well, no, that's not what we're
no one's arguing that.
In fact, that wouldn't actually make sense because the way we're defining trans is based off of the majority.
Right.
So again, it's a recognition of the minority, not a denial.
But in common law kind of, I mean, law's complicated, but generally what's happening, right, is analogy to previous cases and then being applied to a particular case as it comes up. So, I mean, exactly how you handle a particular case is basically the answer is it's for the courts to decide, but there's not like an a priori general theory based off a, so.
And what's implied here is that, at least I'm getting this, you tell me if you're getting it as well. He's implying that what I've done is I've thought about the minorities and then come up with my view of what gender is.
Right.
And it isn't the case.
No.
Now, we've actually looked at what's the case
for
most people.
I'm trying to understand what is gender.
Yeah, how do people use the words?
Will some cases of transgender people coming up feed into me trying to understand what gender is? Of course it will.
Yeah.
But it's not I start with a minority case. Rather, I've got this whole branch of like what gender is. I'm bringing it all in and I'm coming up with a view. And I'm like, what is the best way to make sense of the historical data, of the cultural differences that we have? What's the best way to define this? What has the greatest utility? And then I'm saying, here's a view, and I think this view is great because it covers all of this stuff over here, and it actually involves most trans people, not all trans people, if it lets you go for the self-ID.
So, if I can pack this out in a sort of similar way, his definition encompasses these people.
Yeah.
Your definition encompasses these people, but still makes exclusions. So you can't put a motorbike in here.
Yes.
You can't put a dog in here.
Yeah.
You're still you're including everyone he is.
Yeah.
You've just branched out just a little bit.
And Colin's
to
objection,
include people that he excludes.
Yeah, but Colin's objection then is
what he said is, so you've kept all of this stuff here, and you've added this here, and he's gone, you've blown it all off.
And that's why he says self-ID, and he's like running on along those as if like my view has opened Pandora's box. It hasn't.
No,
it hasn't. And when we get to these fringe cases anyway, he's already accommodating it, but he's doing it by tacking
why do you hate the West?
Because what you've done is you've still got a definition that excludes things, so we're still working off something that is defined, but you've widened the definition a little bit so that trans people can be included, or intersex people can be included, non-binary people can be included. Whereas what he's done is go, yeah, they exist, but I don't really care. I'd rather maintain the old definition.
Yeah.
And we'll have exceptions down the line when we need to.
But not those.
But not those.
Not those exceptions. There are
like,
exceptions, but not
right,
those exceptions.
you can't have a man in a woman's space unless they have certain medical conditions, in which case I'll tell them they're a man, but I'll allow them to treat as a woman out of the kindness of my heart, which means they can go into the women's spaces, which I've said men aren't allowed in.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you've just got this really tangled up sort of thing. Instead of just
Like
saying...
the view is just like this, whereas mine's just
Yeah.
it's dumb.
Yeah.
I want to say something else on having like this almost accusation of me putting first my conclusion, which is I want to incorporate trans people, and then getting my view of gender. We've said that he's making, in some cases when there's fringes, he's going to ignore them. And then in other ones, he's actually redefined his position to accommodate for that.
He's ignoring the data he wants to explain because his conclusion.
Yes.
He started with his conclusion.
But this is it. Like, couldn't someone say the fact that he's not including chromosomes, even though there is a very tight correlation, is actually him saying, you know what, I don't want to include intersex people. So how is it that I can achieve that? Okay, I don't tie it to chromosomes. Now, I wouldn't say this because I don't think that I can understand why someone might make this inference, but I'm not comfortable enough to do it. But the point being is that the way that he phrased my view there actually does have that connotation, at least by my lights.
I just feel like every time that they've tried to understand your point is they've been about as uncharitable as they can be.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like, well, so think of the arguments against his view. It was like, well, look, this is just super impractical. What's it got to do with going in, like, any of our ordinary uses, going in bathrooms or whatever? And then his, like, vice versa, his objection's like, well, look at your view. The world's blown up and it's all gone to hell in a handbasket. Yeah. Like,
That's it.
It's like, well, no, not quite.
just to tie a neat little bow on your... We're not trying to blow it all open. We're not starting with our conclusion of, we need to find a way to fit trans people in.
What I am
right,
as
so
a postmodernist.
what is the definition
You
we've
hate the
got?
waste.
And it's like, right, is that how we're actually addressing things? No, it doesn't appear to be how we're addressing things. How are we addressing things? Does this also then account for these people in a way that is...
It does.
sensible? Oh, it does. Right, well then that is a definition that is more consistent than the one that he's using. And that's all it is we're looking for one that's... It's not blowing the doors open.
Yeah, it's like, Colin, a lot of people are calling Blair White a woman. How do you handle that? The fact that people are doing that? Are they all... So I mean, you can say they're all wrong, right?
Yeah.
But, like, there's a different view that doesn't say they're all wrong, but instead our word can just accommodate Blair White as being a woman because woman can also include, like, social roles and presentation. And then there's just a different view that also accommodates that data. I don't have to say everyone's wrong. I can say, actually, they're right. They're using the word in the right way. And I've just modified my concept a little bit. I've still got all the biology. The world's not blown apart.
And as I said at the very, very beginning, definitions are based on common usage. Common usage seems to be, and he's admitted, that we make inferences on phenotype, aesthetics, and behaviours. So the definition should be describing those things because that's what the common usage is.
Yes.
So
yeah.
it all circles back to why words are the way they are.
Well, there is our marathon of reviewing the debate and also just trying to expand upon our views. You are doing the power stance, so you're winning right now.
Excellent.
Yeah, I just want to make a couple of things clear. So we've issued some criticism of Peter Boghossian here. My view is that I just want to have a conversation with Peter. I have ever since he's accused my view of being deranged and has been talking about Aristotelian metaphysics and nodding along to Richard Dawkins. I still want that conversation, so please, if you want to see that, tell Peter. Like, I've made it very clear, I want a conversation. The second thing to be said is I really enjoyed the conversation with Colin. I feel like I better understand his concerns and his position. It was genuinely a good conversation, and forgive me, but I think it would have been better without Peter. And
You don't need to ask for forgiveness on that. It would have been better without Peter.
But I do.
If he slowed it down at every point.
But without Peter and without Reed and without the team, we may not have had the system that was in place. In fact, we wouldn't. And I did appreciate the system. I think the system actually worked out really nicely. But yeah, you are right when you point out there's elements of whenever I was getting Colin on the ropes to try and make some progress, Peter would just come in and ask a question and just derail completely.
Not deranged, sorry.
Not deranged.
He would derange the conversation.
He would derange the conversation, which I didn't find particularly helpful. But in any case, I found it to be a productive conversation. If you read the comments on my channel, you'll leave thinking a lot of people found it productive. But if you go on Peter's, I'm just woke and like, I'm a not nefarious like motives. It's just. But what can you do about that? Hey, I'm trying to have an open conversation.
I think it says a lot about the sort of audience you fostered.
Yes,
it's one that can
I'm proud of you guys. Yeah, like you can disagree with me and still.
Oh yeah. Well, this is something I saw on. So I saw in your comments as well. Actually, a lot of people saying like, I'm a fan of Peter Boghossian, but I understand your view better now. Now I don't agree, but I appreciate that I understood your view better. And the disparity I saw between the two comments too, is that generally, whether they were for or against your views on your channel, that they tended to be substantive content. So there was either criticism of a point someone made or a request for clarification or something. On Peter's channel, it tended to be more like hero worship of Peter. So kind of like, wow, truly defending the West. It's a shame that another one's gone to woke ideology. Rationality rules ever since the atheist community of Austin
changed his mind.
And now he's just scared of social pressure, so he can't think about these things. The woke mob got him, and it's like,
I mean, what's frustrating on that is that was 3-4 years ago.
Yes, and still you're running from them.
So that. Why wouldn't your mind potentially be changed on certain aspects of it in that time frame? And then second of all, it's like, it's not that the position has changed, it's we've refined it.
But it's also just a completely false narrative.
Of course it is.
Well, they're just not listening to... The problem is that they're not listening to any of the content of that conversation, but instead, you know, it's basically like, well, I've been told by Peter that no one who disagrees with him will talk to him, but now someone is talking to him. How do I make sense of that? This guy's an idiot!
He's fallen away. And one of the things that I did notice in the comments is, wow, you actually do debate people. And I'm like, do you watch my content?
No.
Like, in the last month, I've published a debate with Paul Copan. I've published a debate with Zachary Arden. Like, I debate with people all the time. I talk with people I disagree with all the time. I debated Stefan Molyneux. I debated Cole Benjamin.
And can I add something else funny into all of these people that are sitting there saying, oh, you've woke, you've caved to trans ideology, blah, 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 blah. You've also got a whole bunch of trans people that's still there, call you transphobic.
Don't even know if there's trans people, but there's certainly people that will still come across because of Ethel's content, going, you're a very transphobic person. And maybe there's some ways that they could cash it out and say that I am.
But I think most of the time I've only got reference to the video from years ago.
Assessment. Anyway, was a productive conversation. I really enjoyed it. And Nathan, just cheers for coming down, dude.
Oh, no worries.
I love watching your content. I'm one of the people that probably watch 90% of what you publish. Like, it's just great to get you on the channel, to get your views expressed. I know that you've had quite a bit of content pertaining to Peter Boghossian lately.
His biggest fan, bordering on stalker.
He's not a fan of you though, is he? No. He said that he thinks you're a bad faith actor.
Well, he's also said though that he literally never thinks of me. Whereas I think of him all the time and he never returns my calls.
True.
You said about you watching all of Nathan's content. I have only seen the bit where he was sat there with Peter calling you a bad faith actor and all these other...
No, I'm either incredibly stupid and misinformed or dishonest.
Dishonest.
Is there any other way of explaining that, Peter? Maybe I believe the things I say.
That's the only clip that I've actually seen in content, but it's been awesome to chat, so...
Yeah. Digital Gnosis. That's what the channel's called. I don't know if you like philosophy, religion, and bad jokes. It's over there.
Hi, I'm Reese. Nobody anywhere knows me, unless you watch Low Fruit.
Teams up with Low Fruit, but he's also... I've spoken about all sorts of topics of you for thousands of hours. You're basically my soundboard.
Yeah.
I get to get my good ideas and bad ideas bounced across you. Hopefully before I say them publicly, and so you're like a silent,
somewhat integral to the
I was going to say it's silent cog in the machine.
Well-oiled, greased up. That's why I'm quite known.
That's it.
Well,
only
cheers.
On weekends.
See you later.